Hey everyone, tonight we are stepping back into a world where the air is thin, the slopes are vertical, and the sound of a whistling stone is the last thing a conquistador ever hears. Imagine yourself standing on a narrow, winding trail carved into the side of a granite cliff. Thousands of feet above a roiling river, you are draped in polished steel, carrying the pride of the Spanish Empire. And yet, your heart is hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. You're looking up, squinting against the blinding Andean sun, searching for an enemy you can't quite see, but whose presence is felt in every shifting pebble. You probably wouldn't survive this, let's be honest. Between the altitude sickness and the fact that you essentially a walking tin can in a lightning storm, the odds are not in your favor. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, so go ahead and post your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1536, and you are part of a small, exhausted contingent of Spanish cavalry moving through the highlands. The silence here isn't peaceful, it's heavy. It's the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. Every clink of your horse's bit and every scrape of your boots against the rock seems to echo for miles, announcing your intrusion to the mountains themselves. Suddenly, a sound cuts through the thin, era-sharp, rhythmic whir-whir-whir that builds in intensity until it becomes a low-frequency hum. You look up, and for a split second, you see them. Hundreds of figures silhouetted against the ridgeline, their arms moving in wide, blurring circles. These aren't just peasants with rocks. These are the elite slingers of the Inca Empire, and you have just entered their kill zone. Before you can even draw your sword or pray to a saint, the sky seems to darken. You've been told that your steel morion helmet is the pinnacle of European engineering. Forged in the fires of Toledo and designed to deflect the heaviest of broadswords, but as the first volley arrives, you realize that physics doesn't care about your metallurgy. A smooth, reverblish stone the size of a grapefruit strikes the man beside you. There is no metallic ting, no glancing blow. There is only a sickening wet thud, followed by the sound of metal buckling like a crushed soda can. His helmet doesn't just dent, it caves inward, the force of the impact bypassing the protection entirely to deliver a kinetic shock that turns his brain to jelly instantly. He falls from his horse without a cry, his body hitting the dust with a finality that makes your blood run cold. This is the reality of the warak'a, the Andean sling, a weapon that mainstream historians often categorize as primitive, while overlooking its terrifying efficiency as a high-velocity delivery system. The sheer power behind these projectiles is difficult for the modern mind to grasp, because we tend to think of slinging as a childhood pastime, something David did to Goliath in a Sunday school book. But in the hands of an Inca warrior, the sling was a specialized tool of war that could hurl a stone at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. You watch as another volley descends, and this time, you hear the stones before you see them. They make a high-pitched, predatory scream as they tear through the air. One strikes a nearby rock, and instead of just bouncing off, it shatters into a spray of shrapnel, sending razor-sharp stone shards flying into the faces of your comrades. Historians still argue whether the Inca deliberately chose specific types of stone for their fragmentation properties, or if it was simply a byproduct of the incredible velocities achieved. But in this moment, the why doesn't matter nearly as much as the get out of the way. You scramble for cover behind a rocky outcropping, your breath coming in ragged gasps. The air is so thin up here that every movement feels like you re-dragging your limbs through honey. This is the Andean advantage. The men on the ridge above you were born and bred at these altitudes. Their lungs are larger, their blood is richer in hemoglobin, and they are navigating these cliffs with the grace of mountain goats, while you struggle to keep your balance. To them, this isn't just a battle. It's a calculated demonstration of territorial dominance. They aren't interested in a fair fight. They aren't going to charge down the hill, so you can use your superior reach with a steel rapier. They are going to stay exactly where they are and pelt you with the force of 1,000 hammers until there is nothing left of your expedition but broken steel and bleached bones. It's a quirky bit of fringe history that some early Spanish chroniclers actually claimed the Inca could shoot stones with the accuracy of a modern marksman, allegedly hitting a single Spanish soldier in the eye from over 200 yards away. While that might be a bit of colonial hyperbole intended to make their eventual struggles seem more heroic, the underlying truth remains. The sling was the long-range artillery of the New World. It had a reach that far outstripped the early European arquebus, which was notoriously inaccurate and took an eternity to reload in the damp, thin air of the mountains. You realize, with a sinking feeling, that your firearms are useless here. By the time you could even prime your powder and find a match, you'd have been hit by a dozen stones, each carrying enough energy to shatter a femur. As you peer out from your hiding spot, you see the slingers preparing for another round. They aren't panicked, their movements are fluid, almost dance-like. They hold the long braided cords of the warak'a with a practiced ease, the stones cradled in a central pouch made of toughened leather or woven llama wool. They don't just swing the sling around their heads like a lasso. It's a complex, full-body movement that starts in the legs, twists through the torso, and snaps at the wrist. It's a kinetic chain that funnels every ounce of the warrior's strength into that one tiny focal point. When the release comes, it's a crack like a whip-a-sonic boom in miniature. You notice something else too. Some of the stones being used aren't just natural rocks. They look almost crafted. There's a persistent theory among some researchers that the Inca state actually mass-produced standardized ammunition, shaping stones into consistent aerodynamic spheres to ensure predictable flight paths. If that's true, you're not just facing a group of angry locals. You're facing a military-industrial complex that has optimized the physics of gravity and centrifugal force. The ground around you is littered with these perfect stones, each one a silent testament to the logistical might of the empire you've come to conquer. The sun begins to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, distorted shadows across the pass. The temperature drops instantly, the biting Andean wind whistling through the gaps in your armor. You realize that your steel, which felt like a fortress this morning, is now just a cold, heavy weight that is draining your energy. The Inca above you haven't moved. They don't need to. They have the high ground, they have the range, and they have a weapon that has been perfected over thousands of years to do exactly one thing: break the unbreakable. You are a long way from the plains of Castile, and the rules of war you spent your life learning don't apply here. In the Andes, the stone is king. As you huddle behind that jagged granite outcrop, the physical reality of the weapon being used against you starts to sink in. To understand why your helmet is currently failing you, we have to look at the biomechanics of the warak'a. You see, a sling isn't just a piece of string. It's a mechanical extension of the human arm, a lever that bypasses the natural limits of muscle and bone. When you watch a warrior on the ridge above, his body isn't just moving randomly. He is engaging in a sequence of kinetic energy transfers that would make a modern physicist nod in appreciation. He starts with a wide stance, drawing power from the very earth he stands on. As he begins the rotation, the stone begins to accelerate. But it's the final snap of the wrist at the apex of the arc that does the real damage. This movement effectively doubles the length of his arm, and because the velocity of the stone is proportional to the radius of the circle it's traveling in, that extra length translates into terrifying speed. Historians still argue whether the Inca preferred a single rotation throw for speed or a multi-rotation windup for maximum power. But looking at the dented steel plates of your fallen comrades, the distinction feels academic. The physics here is relentless. When that stone leaves the pouch, it isn't just flying, it is screaming. A standard river stone weighing about half a pound, traveling at 100 miles per hour, carries a kinetic energy profile that rivals a modern .38 caliber bullet. However, while a bullet is designed to pierce, the sling stone is designed to crush. It's the difference between being poked with a needle and being hit by a sledgehammer. Your Morion helmet was built to slide a sword blade off to the side, but it has no give to absorb the blunt force of a 500-gram rock. The energy has to go somewhere, and unfortunately for the person wearing the metal, that somewhere is directly into the skull. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer concussive force even if the stone did unbreak the metal. There's a quirky, almost forgotten detail in some of the Spanish journals where soldiers complained that the vibration of the hits made their teeth fall out or caused their ears to bleed without a single drop of skin being broken. It's a primitive form of traumatic brain injury that 16th century medicine was unremotely prepared to handle. You look down at your own hands and realize they are shaking. It's not just the cold, it's as the realization that your technological superiority, the old-world edges being neutralized by a piece of braided llama wool. The sling is a masterpiece of low-tech, high-output engineering. The mechanics of the release are the most critical part. Think about the precision required. To hit a target at 200 yards, the slinger has to release one of the two cords at the exact millisecond when the centrifugal force is aligned with the target. A fraction of a second too early, and the stone flies into the clouds. A fraction too late, and it slams into the dirt at his feet. And yet, the Inca warriors are doing this with a rhythmic, machine-like consistency. It's reported in some fringe archaeological circles that elite slingers could actually curve their shots by applying a specific thumb flick during the release, giving the stone a lateral spin similar to a pitcher's curveball in baseball. Whether or not they could actually bend the laws of aerodynamics to hit you behind your rock is a terrifying thought to entertain while you repin down. You notice that the sound of the slings changes depending on who is throwing. This is because the warak'a itself is a highly personal tool. Each one is braided to the specific arm length and strength of the individual warrior. A longer sling provides more leverage and more power, but is harder to control in the tight confines of a mountain pass. A shorter sling allows for a faster machine gun style of fire. You are currently being suppressed by a mixture of both. The heavy hitters are lobbing boundary stones from the high ridges to keep you pinned, while the skirmishers closer down the slope are using shorter, snappier slings to pick off anyone who pokes their head out. It's a layered defense system that turns the entire geography into a weapon. One of the mainstream historical facts that often gets lost in the guns, germs, and steel narrative is that the Spanish actually feared the slingers more than the Inca spearmen or archers. In an open field, a horse can outrun a man with a spear, but you can't outrun gravity, and you certainly can't outrun a projectile that hits you before you hear the crack of its release. The thrum of the spinning slings is a psychological weapon in itself. It's a constant low-frequency reminder that you are being watched, measured, and targeted. It's the sound of a countdown. You try to imagine the training that goes into this. This isn't a skill you pick up in a weekend boot camp. This is a lifetime of muscle memory. From the time they were children herding llamas in these very hills, these men have used the sling to keep predators away and to signal across valleys. To them, the sling is an extension of their nervous system. You, on the other hand, are struggling to even reload your heavy crossbow. The cord is damp, your fingers are numb, and the mechanical winch is grinding with grit and dust. By the time you've readied one bolt, the slinger above has already sent 5 stones your way. The rate of fire is simply incomparable. There's a strange beauty to the weapon, if you can look past its lethality for a moment. The way the light catches the braided fibers, rides browns and ochres of natural wool spinning into a blur. But then another stone skips off the top of your cover, sending a shower of sparks and stone dust over your shoulders, and the beauty vanishes. You realize that the Inca aren't just throwing rocks, they are throwing the mountainside at you. They have an infinite supply of ammunition beneath their feet, while every bullet and every bolt you carry had to be shipped across an ocean and hauled up 10,000 feet of vertical terrain. You find yourself staring at a small, perfectly round stone that has rolled to a stop near your boot. It's smooth, cold, and heavy. It looks innocent, like something a child would skip across a pond. But you've seen what it does to a breastplate. You've seen how it can turn a proud knight into a heap of twitching metal. Historians still argue whether the Inca had a unit of stone shapers who did nothing but create these uniform projectiles, or if the soldiers were required to forage and shape their own during the long marches. Either way, the result is a standardized ballistics program that makes your mismatched, hand-cast lead bullets look like a hobbyist's project. The whistling sound starts again, more synchronized this time. It's a signal. The slingers are moving, shifting their positions to catch you in a crossfire. They are using the terrain to amplify the sound, the echoes bouncing off the canyon walls, so you QUNT tell if there are 50 of them or 5,000. You are being hunted by a weapon that uses the very laws of motion to strip away your European armor and expose the fragile human underneath. The Andean wind picks up, carrying the scent of dry earth and the distant, rhythmic whir of the next volley. You realize that out here, in the land of the 4 quarters, your steel is just a loud, heavy liability. To understand how a piece of wool can defeat a suit of steel, you have to look closely at the craftsmanship of the warak'a itself. This isn't just a haphazardly tied string. It is a masterpiece of textile engineering. As you sit pinned behind your rock, You might imagine the Inca women and men back in the highland villages, their fingers flying as they braid these weapons. They use the finest fibers available, the long coarse hair of the llama for durability, or the softer, stronger alpaca wool for a more comfortable grip. Sometimes they even incorporate cabuya, a tough fiber harvested from the agave plant, which provides a structural rigidity that prevents the sling from stretching under the immense tension of a high-speed spin. If the sling stretches, the timing of the release is ruined, and the shot goes wide. But these are woven with a complex 4-ply or 8-ply geometric braid that ensures the tension remains constant, shot after shot. The design is deceptively simple, but incredibly sophisticated. You notice that the central pouch, the cuna, is often split down the middle or woven into a cupped diamond shape. This isn't just for aesthetics, it's a self-centering mechanism. When the stone is placed inside, the split pouch grips it like a hand, ensuring it doesn't slip out prematurely during the violent centrifugal acceleration. Historians still argue whether the specific braiding patterns, often featuring bright zigzags or checkerboards, were merely tribal identifiers, or if they served as a form of coded information, perhaps indicating the rank or the specific village of the slinger. Regardless of the symbolism, the physical result is a tool that feels alive in the hand. You probably wouldn't survive the mental strain of trying to weave one of these yourself while a battle rages. But for the Inca, the creation of the weapon was as ritualistic as its use. As you watch the warriors above, you see them occasionally dipping their slings into the small streams that trickle down the mountainside. This is a quirky, fringe detail often missed. Wetting the fibers can actually change the weight and the snap of the release, preventing the wool from becoming too brittle in the dry Andean air. A brittle sling could snap mid-throw, turning the slinger into his own target. You see one warrior testing the heft of his warak'a, snapping it against the air like a whip. That crack you hear isn't just the sound of the cord hitting itself. It's a miniature sonic boom as the tip of the sling breaks the sound barrier. It's a reminder that even before the first stone is thrown, the Inca have mastered the physics of speed. The mainstream historical consensus is that the Inca military was one of the most organized in the pre-Columbian world, and the production of these slings was a state-mandated industry. Every citizen owed a labor tax called mita, and for many, that meant spending months braiding thousands of these weapons for the imperial armories. You aren't just fighting a group of men, you are fighting a logistical machine that has stockpiled these weapons in every tambo, or roadside storehouse, from Quito to Santiago. If a warrior loses his sling or it wears out from the friction of the stones, he simply reaches into a bag and pulls out another, identical in weight and length. This standardization is what allows them to maintain such a relentless, rhythmic barrage against your position. You realize that the primitive nature of the weapon is actually its greatest strength. While your arquebus requires powder that gets damp and a match that goes out in the wind, the warak'a is immune to the elements. It doesn't rust, it doesn't misfire, and it doesn't run out of ammunition as long as there are rocks on the ground. There is a light irony in the fact that your high-tech European gear is failing because it is too complex for this environment. While the Inca are thriving because they've perfected the simplest of machines, the lever? One of the common jokes among the more cynical Spanish veterans, those who have survived more than a few skirmishes, is that a Spaniard spends half his day cleaning his gun, while an Inca spends half his day choosing which skull he wants to break. It's a dark bit of humor, but looking at the carnage around you, it rings painfully true. The sheer variety of the slings is also a testament to their specialized roles. You see some warriors with long, heavy slings meant for lobbing massive stones over walls. These are the artillerymen. Others carry shorter, lightning-fast slings tucked into their waistbands or wrapped around their heads like turbans, ready to be deployed in a second for close-quarters skirmishing. Some even have double-poused slings, though historians still argue whether these were actually used to throw two stones at once, or if it was a specialized design for throwing odd-shaped incendiary projectiles. Regardless, the adaptability is staggering. You are facing a multi-rolly weapon system that can adjust its range and lethality on the fly, while you are stuck with a single-shot weapon that is currently about as useful as a very heavy stick. As the wind howls through the mountain pass, you notice the warriors aren't just standing still. They are constantly shifting, their feet moving in a synchronized shuffle that keeps their center of gravity low. This is part of the sling dance, To generate maximum torque, the power has to flow from the calves up through the hips and into the shoulder. It is a full-body exertion. You can see the muscles in their backs rippling under their tunics as they prepare for the next volley. This isn't the chaotic throwing of a mob. It is the disciplined execution of a professional cast of soldiers. They have been doing this since they could walk, and it shows in the terrifying grace of their movements. You look down at your own armor, specifically the gaps where the steel plates meet. You've heard rumors, Fringy perhaps, but persistent that the most skilled slingers could aim specifically for the joints in a man's armor. They weren't just trying to break your helmet, they were trying to shatter your knees or your elbows, rendering you immobile and helpless. It's a surgical level of violence that makes the blunt force nature of the weapon even more terrifying. You feel a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability in your neck, right where the gorget meets the helmet. All it would take is one well-placed riverstone, and your journey ends here, in a nameless canyon, thousands of miles from home. The sky is turning a deep, bruised purple as the sun disappears entirely. In the twilight, the slings are even harder to see. You can only hear the thrumming, a sound that seems to vibrate in your very marrow. It's a sound that says the mountains belong to the Inca, and you are merely a guest who has overstayed his welcome. You realize that the very fibers of the warak'a are woven from the animals that live on. These slopes, using plants that grow in this soil to defend the land from an invader who doesn't even understand the ground he's standing on. The sling is more than a weapon. It is the Andes, concentrated into a single lethal snap of wool and stone. The bombardment has momentarily slowed, giving you a chance to look at the ground around your boots. And that S, when you notice the true secret of the Inca's ballistic success, the stones themselves, these aren't just random chunks of mountain granite or jagged limestone. As you reach out to touch one that skipped off your shield, you realize it's a perfectly smooth, egg-shaped river cobble. It feels unnervingly heavy for its size, cold and dense. This is no accident. The Inca didn't just pick up what was underfoot during a fight. They spent weeks, if not months, harvesting these specific stones from the beds of fast-flowing glacial rivers. These stones have been polished by centuries of rushing water until they are almost perfectly symmetrical. In the world of ballistics, symmetry is everything. A jagged rock will tumble and catch the wind, veering off target like a broken bird. But these egg stones are aerodynamic masterpieces. Mainstream historical research into Inca logistics reveals that the empire moved millions of these stones across their road networks. Think about that for a second. An entire imperial economy dedicated in part to moving heavy rocks from the valley floors to the mountain peaks. It's like a pre-modern version of a munitions factory. You probably wouldn't survive the back-breaking labor of carrying a 50-pound sack of these bullets up a 10,000-foot incline. Yet the Inca saw this as a fundamental necessity of war. They knew that a standardized stone meant a predictable shot. When a slinger reached into his woven pouch, he didn't have to guess the weight or the drag coefficient of his ammunition. He knew exactly how it would fly. This consistency allowed for the terrifying curtain of fire that you're currently trying to hide from. There is a quirky, somewhat fringe theory among some specialized archaeologists that the Inca actually had polishing pits where they would manually refine stones that weren't quite perfect enough. They would place the rocks in large stone basins with sand and water, using a rotating wooden tool to grind away any imperfections. If true, it means you aren't just being pelted with rocks, you're being targeted by precision-engineered projectiles. It explains why the Spanish chronicles are full of accounts where the stones seem to seek out the gaps in their formation. It wasn't magic. It was the fact that the Inca had reduced the variables of wind resistance to a near-scientific minimum. While your lead bullets are often lumpy and inconsistent because they were cast in a hurry over a campfire, these stones are uniform, silent, and deadly. Historians still argue whether the Inca categorized their stones by weight classes for different tactical purposes. Some suggest that the lighter, smoother stones were used for long-range harassment to soften an enemy, while the heavier, denser stones, sometimes made of hematite or other heavy minerals, were reserved for the killing blow at close range. As you look at the man lying 5 feet away, his breastplate caved in as if a giant had stepped on him. You suspect the heavy stuff has already arrived. The force of a dense reverbelished stone hitting steel at terminal velocity creates a phenomenon called spalling. Even if the stone doesn't pierce the metal, the shock wave travels through the steel and causes the inside of the armor to fragment, sending tiny shards of your own suit into your body. It's a cruel irony that your protection is being turned into a secondary weapon against you. The sound of these stones is different from anything you've heard on a European battlefield. An arrow has a hiss, a bolt has a whistle, a bullet has a crack. But these stones, they have a thrum. It's a low-pitched, vibrating hum that you feel in your chest before the stone even arrives. It's the sound of the air being shoved aside by a dense mass. One of the common jokes among the veterans in your companies usually told while they are repolishing their useless swords is that the Inca are the only people who can make the air itself sound like a funeral bell. You don't find it particularly funny right now. The rhythmic thrum-thud of the stones hitting the earth around you is hypnotic and terrifying, a percussion section for the end of the world. You notice that some of the stones are a dark, glassy black. This is obsidian, or volcanic basalt, materials that are incredibly hard and prone to shattering into razor-edged flakes upon impact. There is a debate in scholarly circles about whether the Inca purposefully used these fragmenting rounds against unarmored targets to maximize the bleed area, or if they were simply using the best local materials available. From your perspective, it's a lose-lose situation. If the stone stays whole, it crushes your bones. If it shatters, it shreds your skin. You realize that the Inca didn't just understand the physics of the sling. They understood the mineralogy of their world. They knew which stones would hold their shape and which would explode like a primitive grenade. As you hunker down, you see a small pile of these stones that a retreating comrade must have dropped. They are beautiful in a cold, sterile way. Each one is about the size of a large lemon, fits perfectly in the palm, and has a slight texture that would allow the sling's pouch to grip it without slipping. You imagine the millions of man-hours spent stooping over riverbanks, selecting these perfect killers. It asks a level of dedication to the craft of war that makes your own hurried preparations feel amateurish. The Inca didn't just go to war, they prepared the very earth for it. They turned the geography of the Andes into a giant magazine of ammunition. The sun is low enough now that the shadows of the stones are long, making them look like black streaks across the sky. You've noticed that the slingers have stopped using the white stones and are now primarily using the darker ones. You realize with a jolt of fear that this is tactical dark stones are almost impossible to track against the darkening sky. They are taking away your ability to dodge. This is the sophisticated reality of the Stone Age warrior. They are manipulating light, shadow, and physics to ensure that their primitive rocks find their mark. You're not just fighting men, you're fighting a culture that has lived and breathed ballistics for 3,000 years. The wind picks up, and for a moment, the dust clears, revealing the slingers again. They are reloading, their hands moving with a fluid, blurred efficiency. They reach into their waist pouches, find a stone by touch alone, and seat it in the kuna without ever taking their eyes off you. It's a chilling sight. They aren't looking at their weapons. They are looking at you, measuring the distance, calculating the lead, and waiting for the exact moment when you move. You realize that every river stone in that valley is a potential death sentence, and there are more stones in this pass than there are men in all of Spain. The sheer scale of the threat is finally starting to crack your resolve. You're huddled there, watching those hands move with the speed that defies your understanding of manual labor, and you begin to wonder, how does a human being become this proficient? The answer lies in the very fabric of Inca society. Mastery of the sling wasn't an elective, it was a birthright and a requirement. Imagine yourself as a young boy in a high-altitude village. Before you were even trusted with a copper knife or a spear, you were handed a small, soft cord of wool. While children in Europe might have been learning to kick a ball or chase chickens, you were being taught to hit a specific post from 50 paces. This wasn't just for fun. In the Andes, the sling was the primary tool for a shepherd. If a fox or a puma approached your flock of precious llamas, you didn't run at it. You sent a stone to crack its ribs from 100 yards away. By the time an Inca boy reached military age, he had likely thrown tens of thousands of stones. His shoulder wasn't just muscle, it was a finely tuned machine, rebuilt by years of repetitive high-velocity motion. Historians still argue whether the Inca held formal slinging competitions as a way to draft the best marksmen into the emperor's personal guard. But the sheer consistency of the troops you're facing suggests a standardized level of excellence. You probably wouldn't survive the training regimen these men endured. It is said that, in some regions, young men had to prove their worth by knocking the fruit off a tree without damaging the branch, or by hitting a moving target while sprinting across uneven terrain. This childhood conditioning created a warrior who didn't need to aim in the way you understand it. He simply looked at a target and his body calculated the arc, the windage, and the release point through pure instinct. It's the difference between a mathematician solving an equation and a professional athlete making a catch. One is conscious, the other is a reflex. There's a quirky, slightly grim fringe theory that the Inca military actually practiced blindfolded slinging to sharpen their auditory and spatial awareness. The idea was that in the fog of the cloud forests or the pitch black of a night raid, a warrior should be able to hit a target based on sound alone. While that might sound like the stuff of legend, when you hear the stones thudding into the earth precisely where your friends were standing just moments ago, you start to believe it. You see a slinger on the ridge shift his weight, barely glancing in your direction before unleashing a projectile that clips the very edge of your rock. He isn't guessing, he's ranging you. He's using the first few shots to calibrate his internal computer, and now he knows exactly where you are tucked away. One mainstream historical fact that often surprises people is that the slingers were frequently organized by ethnic groups within the empire. The Kola people from the Lake Titicaca region, for instance, were renowned as the most fearsome slingers in the world. When the Sapa Inca called for his armies, he didn't just want soldiers, he wanted the specialists. You aren't just fighting the Inca, you might be facing the elite Kola marksmen who have been the terror of the highlands for generations. They bring with them a tradition of warfare, where the sling is the primary symbol of masculinity and power. For them, the warak'a is more than a weapon, it's a testament to their heritage. This cultural obsession with the tool meant that when they faced the Spanish, they weren't learning a new way of war. They were simply applying their daily survival skills to a new type of predator. You notice the rhythm of their fire. It's not a chaotic barrage, it's a disciplined cadence. One group throws while the other reloads, creating a walking wall of impact that forces you to stay pinned down. If you try to move, the cadence shifts. It's like being trapped in a giant mechanical clock where the gears are made of stone and the ticking sound is the crack of a whip. You've seen your own captains try to organize a coordinated volley with arquebuses, but the smoke, the noise, and the technical failures usually turn it into a mess. Here, there is no smoke. There is no flash. There is only the invisible death that arrives with a hum. It's a clean, terrifyingly efficient way to conduct a massacre. There's a bit of light-hearted irony in your situation, though you're in no mood to laugh. Back in Spain, the noble weapon is the sword or the lance. The sling is something for peasants and shepherds, something to be looked down upon. Yet here you are, a noble warrior, being utterly humiliated by the very tools you considered beneath you. It's a classic case of bringing a knife to a gunfight. Except in this case, the gun is a piece of string and the knife is your expensive, heavy steel. You realize that the Inca aren't backward, they've just optimized their technology for their specific environment. They didn't need gunpowder because they had perfected the biomechanical delivery of kinetic energy. As you watch, one slinger does something unusual. He holds his sling with both hands for a moment, stretching the wool to its limit, then performs a low, sweeping rotation that looks different from the others. Historians still argue whether this underhand style was used specifically for skip shots bouncing the stone off the flat ground to hit enemies behind cover. Suddenly, a stone skips off the dirt in front of your outcrop, flying upward at an impossible angle and nearly catching you under the chin. You realize there is no safe angle. They aren't just throwing at you. They are playing the terrain like a musical instrument, using every flat rock and every slope to find a way around your defenses. The physical toll on the slingers must be immense, yet they show no signs of slowing down. Their shoulders must be built like granite, their rotator cuffs reinforced by years of this violent snapping motion. You think about the slinger's elbow, a modern term for the repetitive strain injuries found in ancient skeletons, where the bone of the throwing arm is actually denser and thicker than the non-throwing arm. These men have literally been reshaped by their weapon. Their skeletons are living records of their service to the empire. When you look at them, you aren't looking at soldiers. You're looking at a specialized subspecies of warrior, evolved for the sole purpose of hurling stones through the mountain air. You realize that the sun is almost gone now, and the temperature is plummeting. The thin air makes your lungs burn, and the weight of your armor is becoming unbearable. But the slingers, they are still there. They are part of this landscape, as much as the llamas and the peaks. They don't need to hurry. They have the patience of the mountains themselves. They know that eventually you will have to move. You will have to come out from behind that rock, and when you do, they will be ready, their slings already spinning in that eternal rhythmic circle, waiting for the one release that will end your journey. You're clutching your shield, the vibration of another near miss still humming through your forearm, and you find yourself staring at your fallen comrade's helmet. It's a morion, the iconic high-crested headpiece of the Spanish tercios. Back in Seville, this was considered the ultimate protection. A masterpiece of metallurgical science designed to deflect the heavy downward strokes of a German broadsword or the piercing thrust of a pike. But as you look at the jagged, inward curving hole where a river stone punched through the steel, you realize the fundamental flaw in European defensive philosophy. Your armor was built for the glancing blow. Its slopes and ridges are meant to make a blade slide off harmlessly. However, a sling stone doesn't slide. It arrives with the concentrated weight of half a pound of solid matter focused onto a single point of impact, and it doesn't care about the angle of your crest. The mainstream historical reality is that 16th century Spanish steel was actually quite thin, often only 1 to 2 millimeters thick, to keep it wearable for long marches. While this was sufficient to stop a low-velocity arrow or a slashing sword, it was catastrophically vulnerable to the high-velocity point loading of an Inca stone. When that stone hits, it causes the steel to exceed its elastic limit instantly. Instead of the helmet absorbing the energy, the metal simply fails, shattering or deforming directly into the skull. Historians still argue whether the Spanish morion was actually worse for this type of combat than no helmet at all, as the buckled steel often created secondary puncture wounds that were impossible to treat. You probably wouldn't survive the surgery required to remove a piece of your own helmet from your frontal lobe, especially not with a rusty dagger and a prayer as your only medical options. There's a quirky, dark bit of military history suggesting that some Spanish soldiers, after seeing enough of their friends' heads crushed like eggs, actually began to discard their superior steel helmets in favor of local Andean headgear. They noticed that the Inca warriors wore thick, quilted cotton tunics and turbans, reinforced with slats of hardwood or woven cane. This soft armor was actually better at dissipating the energy of a stone, while the steel transmitted the shockwave directly to the bone. The layers of cotton and wood absorbed and spread the impact, turning a lethal blow into a nasty bruise. You see the irony? The civilized soldier is being forced to adopt primitive gear just to stay alive. It's a humbling realization that your European pride is literally getting people killed. The sound of a stone hitting a morion is something you'll never forget. It's not a clink, it's a crack followed by a hollow, metallic ringing, like a church bell being struck by a hammer. You've seen men who weren't even hit directly by the stone fall to their knees, clutching their heads in agony. The concussive resonance of phrase, modern ballistics experts, might use sent a shockwave through the helmet that could burst eardrums and cause massive internal hemorrhaging. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer disorientation of a near miss. Your equilibrium would be shattered, leaving you stumbling in the dirt while the next volley is already in the air. As you look up, you see the sun reflecting off the helmets of the other men in your line. You are essentially a row of shiny targets. To a slinger, that glint of steel is a beacon. They don't need to see your face, they just need to aim for the brightest spark on the hillside. You find yourself trying to rub dirt and ash onto your polished breastplate, desperately trying to dull the finish. It's a survival instinct that overrides your training. You were taught that a clean soldier is a disciplined soldier, but in the Andes, a clean soldier is a dead soldier. The steel mythos of the conquistador, the idea that you are an invincible titan-clad in the forge fires of Europe, is evaporating with every stone that strikes the earth. One of the light-hearted, if you can call it that, jokes among the rank and file is that the Spanish king should have sent blacksmiths instead of priests, because your gear is in constant need of repair. A single skirmish with slingers leaves a suit of armor looking like it has been through a hailstone storm made of lead. The dents are everywhere, your greaves are pitted, your breastplate has a permanent crinkle in the center, and your shield is starting to look like a piece of beaten copper. Historians still argue about the economic toll this took on the Spanish expeditions. Every piece of armor that was ruined had to be replaced by shipments from the coast, which were often intercepted by, you guessed it, more slingers. You notice a warrior on the ridge who seems to be targeting the crests of the helmets specifically. This is a terrifying display of marksmanship. He isn't just trying to hit the man, he's showing off. He knocks the decorative plume off a captain's helmet with one shot, then follows it up with a stone that clips the metal rim, sending the helmet spinning into the ravine. It's a psychological tactic designed to show you that your impenetrable shells are nothing more than toys to them. You feel a cold sweat breaking out under your padded doublet. You're trapped in a metal box that has become a liability. A heavy, hot, and loud tomb that tells the enemy exactly where to aim. There's a fringe theory that the Inca actually developed a counter-armor stone, one that was slightly flatter on one side to prevent it from glancing off curved surfaces, whether it was intentional or just a result of the natural riverstone selection. The effect is the same. The stones grip the steel for a fraction of a second, long enough to deliver their full kinetic payload. You watch a stone hit a shield at an oblique angle, and instead of skipping off into the air, it seems to bite into the metal, transferring all its momentum into the arm of the soldier holding it. You hear the wet snap of bone, the shield drops, and the soldier is left defenseless. The wind shifts again, bringing with it the smell of ozone and dry grass. You realize that your morion, once a symbol of your status and your safety, is now a heavy weight pulling your head down, making it harder to breathe the thin mountain air. You look at the Inca warriors, their heads wrapped in simple, colorful cloths, moving with a freedom you can only envy. They have nothing to dent, they have nothing to shatter. They are as light as the wind, while you are as heavy as the grave. The steel mythos didn't just fail you, it betrayed you. It promised you invincibility and delivered you into a trap where your very protection is the weapon of your destruction. The shadows are stretching long and jagged across the valley floor, but the memory of your first true engagement at Cajamarca feels as fresh as the cold wind biting at your neck. You remember standing in that crowded square, the smell of damp earth and tension thick enough to taste. You were surrounded by the elite of the Spanish force. Yet for the first time, the legendary Spanish brio felt fragile. It wasn't the sight of the Sapa Inca on his golden litter that unsettled you most, it was the sound. Before the first parley was even finished, the hills surrounding the square began to vibrate with a rhythmic, low-frequency thrumming. It was the sound of thousands of warak'as being readied simultaneously. You looked up and saw a ring of warriors, their arms moving in a terrifyingly synchronized rotation. It felt like standing inside the heart of a massive, prehistoric machine. Mainstream history often focuses on the treachery and the capture of Atahualpa. But for you, the foot soldier Cajamarca was the moment you realized that the Inca weren't just natives, they were a disciplined, industrial-scale military power. When the signal was finally given, the sky didn't just fill with stones. It felt like the very atmosphere had turned to lead. You probably wouldn't survive that initial shock if you had been standing shoulder to shoulder with men whose fear was as cold as your own. The volley was so dense that it blocked out the sun for a flickering second, a curtain of gray river stones raining down with the force of a localized hurricane. This was the Inca softening tactic, a way to break the cohesion of your line before a single spear was even leveled. Historians still argue whether the Inca commanders at Cajamarca intentionally held back their full slinging power to avoid hitting their own leader, or if the sheer chaos of the Spanish cavalry charge simply moved too fast for the slingers to track. But you remember the stones hitting the stone walls of the plaza with the sound of rapid-fire hammers? One of the quirky, lesser-known details from the chronicles is that several Spanish horses actually bolted, not from the sound of the archaeobus switch they were trained for, but from the terrifying whistling of the stones. The high-pitched scream of a carved whistling stone is a sound that bypasses the rational mind and speaks directly to the lizard brain. It's a sound that says predator, and even the bravest warhorse knows when it's being hunted. You see a captain near you trying to maintain order, his voice cracking as he screams for the men to raise their bucklers. But a buckler is a small thing when the air is full of half-pound projectiles. You watch as a stone catches a man's shield at the exact moment he lowers it to breathe. It doesn't just hit him, it seems to find the one weak point in his stance. This is the area denial capability of the sling. At Cajamarca, the Inca weren't just trying to kill you. They were trying to compress you, to herd you into a tight, panicked mass where your horses would be useless and your long-range weapons couldn't be aimed. You felt like a sheep being driven into a pen, and the slingers were the dogs nipping at your heels with kinetic energy. There's a light, bitter joke that made the rounds after that day, that the Pope should have blessed the rocks instead of the men, because the rocks certainly seemed to have a clearer mission. At the time, nobody was laughing. You were too busy trying to keep your head from being caved in by a projectile that cost nothing to make and was delivered with more accuracy than your expensive firearms. The arquebus, for all its smoke and thunder, was a slow, temperamental beast. You saw a fellow soldier frantically trying to load his piece, his hands shaking so much he spilled his powder, only to be struck in the shoulder by a stone that sent him spinning. The rate of fire from the Inca line was approximately 10-1. For every lead ball you sent into the air, 10 stones came back to meet you. One of the most scholarly debates regarding Cajamarca is why the Inca did simply overwhelm the small Spanish, forced with a continuous barrage from the surrounding heights. Some suggest it was a matter of ritual protocol that the Sapa Inca believed his presence alone would suffice to cow the bearded ones. Others argue it was a logistical choice, saving their primary volleys for the open field. Regardless of the reason, that first contact taught you a lesson your commanders didn't want to hear. Your armor was a psychological comfort, not a physical guarantee. You saw the way the stones dented the high-quality steel of the officers' breastplates, leaving them looking like they'd been pelted by a giant's gravel. You remember the feeling of the rhythmic thrum deep in your marrow. It's a sound that stays with you even now as you hide behind this outcrop years later. It's the sound of the Empire's pulse. At Cajamarca, the Inca demonstrated that they didn't need to match your technology to defeat your physics. They just needed to refine their own. You saw a slinger on a nearby wall, a man no older than 20, who seemed to be picking off individual buttons on a soldier's doublet just to prove he could. It was a terrifying display of casual mastery. It made you feel small, not just in number, but in skill. There is a fringe theory that the Inca actually used incendiary stones at Cajamarca rocks, wrapped in oil-soaked llama, wool, and set ablaze, though most historians believe this tactic was refined later during the siege of Cusco still. The image of flaming streaks arching through the air added to the supernatural dread of the moment. You felt like you were fighting the gods of the mountain themselves, and they were using the very bones of the earth to cast you out. Every stone that hit the ground near you was a message. You do not belong here. As the skirmish at the plaza ground on, you noticed that the Inca didn't seem to tire. Their arms moved with the same fluid, circular grace from the first hour to the last. This endurance is part of the selection of the chosen training we talked about earlier. These weren't men who had to think about their weapon. They were the weapon. You, meanwhile, were already exhausted from the weight of your steel and the lack of oxygen. The rhythmic thrum of the slings became the heartbeat of your fear. A constant reminder that as long as there were stones and as long as there were Inca, you would never truly be safe in the land of the four quarters. You're staring at that dented helmet, and your mind can't help but drift to the medical reality of what you just witnessed. In Europe, a doctor might deal with the clean puncture of a rapier or the jagged tear of a halberd, but the injuries produced by the warak'a are a different breed of horror. This is the anatomy of an impact. When a half-pound river stone traveling at 120 feet per second strikes a human target, it doesn't just damage the point of contact, it delivers a massive kinetic dump. If it hits your thigh, even through padded wool, the shockwave can shatter the femur into dozens of needle-like shards without the stone ever breaking the skin. This is blunt force trauma on an industrial scale. You see a soldier a few paces away, clutching his arm. He looks strangely limp, the bone snapped mid-shaft by a stone that didn't even leave a mark on his sleeve. The most terrifying aspect is the headshot. Historians still argue whether the Inca intentionally aimed for the temple and the base of the skull, but the frequency of these injuries suggests a lethal level of precision. When the stone hits the steel of your morion, the metal deforms inward in a fraction of a millisecond. This creates a dynamic bulge that strikes the skull. Even if the steel doesn't breach, the brain is sloshed violently against the interior of the cranium. You probably wouldn't survive the resulting subdural hematoma. In a world without neurosurgery, a minor head strike from a sling stone is a slow, agonizing death sentence. You've seen men walk away from a hit, seemingly fine, only to collapse and die 3 hours later as their brain began to swell against their own bone. There is a quirky, somewhat gruesome tidbit from the Spanish archives where surgeons noted that Inca stone wounds were cleaner than gunshot wounds, but far harder to treat. A lead bullet from an arquebus often carries bacteria and bits of dirty clothing into the wound, leading to rapid infection. A smooth river stone, however, is relatively sterile, but it pulverizes everything it touches. It turns muscle into a bruised mash and splinters bone in ways that make it impossible to set. You look at the bone setters in your company, and they look defeated. They have no tools for this. To fix a limb shattered by a sling, You'd need a modern trauma ward, not a wooden table and a bottle of wine. It's a specialized form of violence that focuses on structural failure rather than blood loss. Mainstream bioarchaeology has actually provided us with a window into this reality through the study of skeletal remains from the period. Many skulls found in Andean battle sites show evidence of trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure. This wasn't some primitive ritual. It was a highly advanced response to the very weapon you are currently facing. The Inca doctors were perhaps the most skilled cranial surgeons in the world, specifically because they had so much practice dealing with sling injuries. They understood that the invisible pressure inside the head was the real killer. You, however, don't have an Inca surgeon. You have a barber surgeon who thinks your humors are out of balance because you breathed too much mountain air. You watch another volley come in, and you notice how the men react. They don't just duck, they flinch with their whole bodies. The sound of the impact is a wet crunch that haunts your dreams. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of non-bleeding lethality. There is something uniquely unnerving about seeing a man fall dead without a drop of blood being spilled. His body simply shutting down because his internal organs were liquefied by the vibration of a strike to the torso. It feels more like being struck by lightning than being hit by a weapon. You realize that Inca aren't just fighting your body, they are shattering your understanding of how a human is supposed to die. One of the lighter asides, if you can find humor in a massacre, is the Spanish obsession with the stone that speaks. Some soldiers claimed that the Inca could make the stones scream your name. While this was likely just the acoustic effect of the whistling stones we talked about earlier, it highlights the supernatural dread these injuries inspired. You aren't just worried about a rock, you're worried about a projectile that seems to have a malicious intent. When you see a comrade's jaw hanging at an impossible angle after a grazing blow, you realize the power of the warak'a is far greater than the sum of its parts. It is the perfect delivery system for pure, unadulterated momentum. The anatomy of the impact also extends to your horses. A horse's skull is surprisingly thin in places, and its legs are incredibly fragile. You've seen a single well-placed stone strike a stallion in the knee, effectively killing the horse as it can no longer stand. Without your mount, you are just a slow, heavy target in a very large, very steep arena. The Inca know this. They aren't trying to kill the horse, they're trying to disable the engine of your mobility. You see the animal's hide ripple under the force of the strike, the kinetic energy traveling through the tissue like a wave in a pond. The horse screams, a sound that pierces through the thrumming of the slings, and you feel the last of your tactical advantage slipping away. There is a fringe theory that the Inca used weighted stones, natural rocks with high iron contents, specifically for these bone-shattering shots. Whether by design or by the luck of the local geology, the result is a ballistic profile that makes your steel armor feel like it's made of parchment. You reach up to touch your own ribs, wondering if they could withstand a hit. You realize that beneath the steel and the pride, you are just a collection of fragile bones and soft tissue, and the Inca are masters of the physics required to break both. As the dusk deepens, the medical reality of the day's skirmish becomes a symphony of groans and labored breathing. There is no glory in a sling wound. There is only the dull, throbbing ache of crushed bone, and the terrifying realization that your body has been broken from a distance you could even see. The rhythmic thrum starts up again, a reminder that the Inca have plenty of stones left, and your anatomy has many more points of failure they haven't yet explored. You sink deeper into the shadow of the rock, praying that the next thud you hear isn't the sound of your own protection failing you. You're crouched there, waiting for the next thrum of a stone, and you can't help but look at your archaeobus, that heavy, soot-stained tube of iron and wood, resting across your lap. It was supposed to be the great equalizer, the weapon that would sweep the primitive world aside with the power of modern chemistry. But here, in the thin, biting air of the Andes, the comparison between European black powder and the Inca sling is almost laughable. Your arquebus is a temperamental, high-maintenance beast. To fire a single shot, you have to measure out the powder, ram a lead ball down the barrel, prime the pan, and keep a slow matcha smoldering cord of hem constantly lit and ready. In this wind, your match is flickering and dying. In the damp mountain mist, your powder turns to a useless black sludge. Meanwhile, the slinger above you has already loosed 4 stones in the time it took you to even find your tinderbox. Mainstream military history often paints the Spanish conquest as a victory of guns over sticks. But the reality on the ground was a nightmare of mismatched ballistics. The arquebus had an effective point-blank range of maybe 50 yards if you actually wanted to hit a specific human being. Beyond that, the smoothbore barrel sent the lead ball spinning wildly off course. An Inca slinger, however, is effective at 200 yards, and a truly elite warrior can lob a stone with enough force to kill at over 300. You are effectively outranged by a weapon made of wool. You probably wouldn't survive a sniper duel in this environment. By the time you see the flash of a slinger's movement, he has already accounted for the wind and the drop, while you're still trying to remember if you put the wadding in. There's a quirky, almost comical detail in some of the Spanish journals about the psychology of the reload. When a Spaniard fired his arquebus, the massive boom and the cloud of white smoke were intended to terrify the enemy, making them think the thunder god had arrived. But the Inca quickly realized the trick. They learned to watch for the smoke, and the moment they saw the flash, they knew they had at least 60 seconds of total safety while the soldier fumbled with his gear. They would actually step out from cover, mock the soldiers, or even use that window to reposition closer. It's a light-hearted bit of tactical irony. Your loudest, most terrifying weapon actually became a giant safe to attack. Now signal for the enemy. Historians still argue whether the Inca viewed the arquebus with any real fear after the initial shock of Cajamarca wore off. Some suggest they saw it as a clumsy sling that required fire to work a weapon for people who were unstrong or fast enough to use a warak'a. As you look at the complex mechanism of your matchlock, you start to agree. The sling is instant. It is silent until the stone is already too close to dodge. The harquebus, on the other hand, is a loud, smelly, and slow affair that tells everyone within 3 miles exactly where you are. You're essentially trading stealth, speed, and range for a little bit of smoke and a whole lot of frustration. The suppression power of the two weapons is also worlds apart. To keep an enemy pinned down with firearms, you need a massive line of soldiers firing in ranks the volley fire that would be fully perfected for another century. But a handful of Inca slingers can create a constant, overlapping curtain of stones. Because their rate of fire is so high, there's never a quiet moment for you to charge. You've seen your sergeant try to order a rush, only for the entire group to be driven back into the shadows by a relentless rain of river cobbles. It is a specialized form of area denial that works better than any black powder weapon of your era. The slingers aren't just hitting people, they are controlling the very geometry of the battlefield. There's a fringe theory, though it gained some traction among experimental archaeologists, that the Inca actually outperformed the Spanish in armor penetration tests. While a lead ball would often flatten against high-quality steel, the sheer mass and velocity of a heavy stone delivered a more destructive shock to the structural integrity of the helmet. You've seen lead balls bounce off Inca hardwood shields, leaving only a gray smear, while a sling stone can split that same shield in half. It makes you wonder, who is truly advanced? Is it the man who relies on a temperamental chemical reaction, or the man who has mastered the kinetic energy of his own biology? You find yourself looking at your powder flask, which is nearly empty. Getting more powder means a months-long journey to the coast and a wait for a ship that might never come. But look at the ground. Ammunition is everywhere. The Inca have a logistics-free weapon system. Every mountain is a magazine. Every river is a munitions factory. This is the ultimate guerrilla advantage. While you are tethered to a global supply chain that is thousands of miles long, the Inca are fueled by the very earth they are defending. It's a humbling realization that your modern war machine is starving to death in a land of plenty. One of the common jokes among them, and usually whispered so the priests do unhear, is that the devil invented the arquebus to make men feel powerful right before he lets the Inca kill them. It's a dark bit of gallows humor that reflects the deep insecurity you all feel. You were promised that your technology would make you gods, but instead it has made you slow, loud, and vulnerable. The thrum of the slings continues, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat that mocks the frantic, sporadic bang of your few remaining firearms. As the wind dies down, you hear the clatter of stones again. You realize that your arquebus isn't a weapon anymore. It's a heavy, iron security blanket that isn't actually keeping you warm. The Inca are still up there, their wool slings as ready as they were at dawn. And they don't need a match, a spark, or a prayer to make them work. They just need a target. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and wait, wondering if the next sound you hear will be the hiss of a fuse or the scream of a stone that doesn't miss. The air up here doesn't just feel thin, it feels sharp, like you're breathing in tiny needles of ice that refuse to settle in your lungs. You're at over 13,000 feet, and every heartbeat feels like a drum echoing in your ears. This is the high-altitude advantage, a biological fortress that the Inca have occupied for millennia. And it's arguably as lethal as the stones they hurl. As you gasp for air, your chest heaving under the weight of your breastplate, you look up and see the warriors moving with a terrifying fluid agility. They aren't gasping, they aren't pausing to clutch their sides. Their bodies are adapted to this thin world. They possess larger lung capacities and a higher concentration of red blood cells, a physiological gift from the peaks. To them, this slope is a playground. To you, it is a slow-motion execution chamber. Mainstream history often overlooks the hypoxic element of the conquest, focusing instead on the clash of steel. But the reality is that the Spanish were often fighting at perhaps 50% of their physical capacity. You probably wouldn't survive a sprint of even 50 yards in this environment without collapsing. Yet the Inca slingers are able to rotate their entire bodies, generating massive torque for their shots without breaking their breathing rhythm. This disparity in stamina means that even if you manage to close the distance, you'd arrive at the Inca line exhausted, trembling, and unable to lift your sword. The mountains are their silent allies, stripping away your strength long before the first stone ever leaves the pouch. There's a quirky, almost supernatural observation in the chronicles where Spanish soldiers claimed the Indians had iron lungs, or that they were fueled by the coca leaves they chewed constantly. While the coca certainly helped with the fatigue, the real magic was the centuries of evolutionary adaptation. You see a warrior leap from one rock to another, mid-swing, landing with the grace of a cat, while unleashing a stone that nearly takes your ear off. If you tried that movement, your equilibrium already hammered by the lack of oxygen would send you tumbling into the abyss. Historians still argue whether the Inca deliberately drew the Spanish into higher and higher elevations to exploit this breathless vulnerability. But looking at the chosen battlefields, it seems like a masterclass in strategic geography. You find yourself resenting the very air you're trying to breathe. It's a strange feeling being betrayed by the atmosphere itself. One of the lighthearted, if somewhat morbid jokes among the veterans is that the Andes don't want you here, and they're trying to suck the life out of you through your own nose. You look at your companions, and their faces are a sickly shade of gray-blue, their lips darkened by the lack of oxygen. The Inca, by contrast, have a ruddy, healthy glow to their skin. They are in their element, and the sling is the perfect weapon for a high-altitude skirmisher because it requires no heavy equipment to transport. While you are hauling cannons and heavy iron through passes that make your heart stutter, they are carrying a weapon that weighs less than a pound. The rhythmic thrum of the slings feels louder in this thin air, the sound carrying further and sharper than it would at sea level. The physics of sound changes here, and the Inca know how to use the echoes of the canyons to disorient you. You hear a crack to your left, but the stone hits the rock to your right. It's a sensory nightmare. You're lightheaded, your vision is tunneling, and the world is becoming a kaleidoscope of gray stone and whistling death. You realize that your tactical manuals, written for the flat plains of Italy or the rolling hills of Spain, are utterly useless here. You aren't just fighting a military, you're fighting an ecosystem. In scholarly circles, there is a phrase often used, the vertical empire. The Inca didn't just live on the mountains, they mastered the layers of them. They understood that every 1,000 feet of elevation changed the rules of engagement. At this height, the cold is its own weapon. Your fingers are so numb, you can't feel the trigger of your crossbow. But the slinger's hands, wrapped in warm alpaca wool gloves with the fingers cut out, are nimble and precise. They have solved the problem of the cold with the same textile genius they used to create the warak'a. You feel like a clumsy intruder in a house where the owner knows every creaking floorboard and every hidden trapdoor. There's a fringe theory that the Inca actually timed their barrages to coincide with the most difficult parts of a climb, waiting until the Spanish were at their most oxygen-starved to unleash the heaviest stones. It's a cruel, efficient way to fight. You watch a horse stumble, its lungs whistling as it tries to find purchase on the scree. A single stone, not even a large one, strikes the animal's flank, and the shock is enough to send it over the edge. You hear the long, fading scream of the horse as it falls, and you realize that your superior cavalry is nothing more than a liability in this vertical world. The high-altitude advantage isn't just about breathing, it's about the total mastery of gravity. As the sun begins to dip, the thinning of the air seems to accelerate the coming of the night. The shadows are sharper, the cold more aggressive. You look up at the ridge, and the slingers are still there, silhouetted against the purple sky. They look like statues, unmoving, untired. They have the patience of predators who know their prey is already half dead from the climb. You realize that the Inca didn't need to build massive walls to keep you out. They just needed to let you climb until your heart gave out, and then let the stones do the rest. The wind picks up a freezing gale that tears at your cloak and makes the thrum of the slings sound like the mountain itself is growling. You try to take a deep breath, but there's nothing. There's just a cold emptiness that leaves you dizzy. You look at the stone in front of you, the one that almost ended your journey, and you realize it didn't have to travel very fast to kill you. At this altitude, your body is already so close to the edge that even a small push is enough to send you over. The Inca aren't just throwing stones. They are providing the final kinetic nudge into the grave the mountains have already dug for you. The stones aren't just falling now. They are arriving in structured, overlapping waves that suggest a tactical sophistication far beyond a simple skirmish. This is the curtain of stones, a method of area denial that the Inca commanders use to paralyze your movement. You look to your left and see a gap in the rocks that might offer better cover. But the moment you shift your weight, a dozen stones erupt into the dust exactly where you intended to step. They aren't trying to hit you specifically yet. They are painting the ground around you, creating a lethal perimeter that keeps you exactly where they want you. It's a specialized form of psychological and physical suppression. If you stay still, you're a sitting duck. If you move, you're stepping into a pre-calculated kill zone. Mainstream military historians often focus on the individual lethality of the sling. But the true genius of the Inca army was their ability to coordinate these volleys at the unit level. Imagine 1,000 slingers divided into ranks, firing in a rotating sequence. As the first rank releases, the second is already mid-swing, and the third is reaching into their pouches. This creates a literal wall of kinetic energy. You probably wouldn't survive the mental exhaustion of trying to time your movements between these pulses of stone. There is no gap in the fire, no moment of silence to reload your own courage. It is a relentless, percussive barrage that turns the open air into a solid barrier of whistling, lead-colored river cobbles. Historians still argue whether the Inca had fire directors, officers who used whistles or specific hand signals to direct the concentrated fire of hundreds of men onto a single point. Based on the way the fire is currently walking toward your position, you're inclined to believe they do. It's a quirky, terrifying detail. You hear a single, high-pitched bird call from the ridge, and suddenly the focus of the bombardment shifts with surgical precision. They are treating the mountainside like a chessboard, and you are a piece that is slowly being backed into a corner. You've seen Spanish artillery try to achieve this kind of saturation, but the cannons are too slow, too heavy, and too prone to exploding. The Inca have achieved the same tactical result with nothing but wool, stones, and discipline. One of the lighter, though no less dangerous, aspects of this area denial is the use of smaller, lighter stones to flush men out of hiding. You feel a series of stinging impacts against your boots and calves, not enough to break bone, but enough to make you dance. It's a mocking gesture. They are hurting you, just as a shepherd uses a sling to nudge a stubborn llama back into the fold. The Inca slingers are using these stinger shots to force you out into the open, where the heavy hitters can finish the job. You see a comrade lose his nerve and bolt for a nearby ravine. He doesn't make it 5 steps before a heavy, egg-shaped stone catches him in the small of the back, folding him in half instantly. There is a scholarly debate phrase often used when discussing these tactics: the geometry of control. The Inca didn't view the battlefield as a flat plane. They viewed it as a 3-dimensional space where gravity was their primary ally. By staying on the heights, they ensure that every stone they throw gains potential energy as it falls. While every shot you attempt, be it a bolt or a bullet, has to fight the very laws of physics to reach them. You are firing up into a void. They are firing down into a target-trick environment. This tactical curtain isn't just about the number of stones. It's about the fact that they can see every move you make before you even make it. You notice that the stones hitting the ground near you are starting to pile up, creating a treacherous, shifting layer of marbles on the already steep slope. This is another quirk of the Inca siege style. They aren't just hitting you with stones, they are changing the terrain. Every missed shot makes the ground more difficult for your horses to stand on and more likely for you to slip. It's a specialized form of environmental engineering. You're trying to maintain your footing on a carpet of smooth, round projectiles that act like ball bearings under your boots. One slip, and you're exposed. One slip, and you're a dead man. There's a fringe theory that the Inca actually used smoke-trailing stones, rocks dusted with fine colored powder or soot, to help their commanders see where the volleys were landing in the dim light. As you watch, you see a faint puff of white dust as a stone strikes a rock nearby. It acts like a tracer round, allowing the slinger to adjust his aim for the next shot. You realize you're being zeroed in by a primitive but effective targeting system. The thrum of the slings is no longer a general noise. It's becoming a focused, intentional sound that is getting closer with every rotation. As the curtain tightens around you, the psychological weight becomes almost unbearable. You feel the air vibrating with the passage of the stones, a constant FWT, FWT, FWT that sounds like the wings of 1,000 angry birds. You realize that your steel armor, your horses, and your gunpowder were all designed for a different kind of war. You were prepared for a clash of armies, but you're stuck in a physics experiment where you are the variable being eliminated. The Inca aren't just fighting a battle. They are conducting a strategic denial of your very existence in this space. The wind howls, and for a second, the curtain lifts as the slingers reposition. You take a desperate, gasping breath, but you know it's only a temporary reprieve. They aren't finished. They are just resetting the stage for the next act. You look at the pile of stones around you, standardized, smooth, and lethal land. You realize that as long as the mountains stand, the Inca will never run out of ammunition. They have all the time in the world, and you are running out of breath, out of cover, and out of luck. The thrumming begins again, lower and more menacing than before. And the first stone of the new wave strikes your shield with a force that nearly knocks you backward into the abyss. As the twilight deepens, you notice a change in the sky. The gray streaks of the river stones have been replaced by something far more terrifying, streaks of glowing orange and red arching through the thin mountain air. This is the heated shot strategy, an ingenious and terrifying Inca adaptation that turns their simple slings into long-range incendiary artillery. You watch, transfixed, as a slinger on the ridge takes a stone that has been sitting in a bed of hot coals, wraps it quickly in a pre-moistened patch of llama wool or pitch-soaked fiber, and whips it into the sky. By the time it reaches its apex, the friction of the air and the combustible wrapping have turned the projectile into a miniature meteor. You probably wouldn't survive the chaos of a midnight fire in a camp where every tent is made of dry wool and every roof is thatched with ichu grass. Mainstream history often credits the Spanish with bringing total war to the Andes. But the siege of Cusco proved that the Inca were masters of strategic destruction. They didn't just want to hit you, they wanted to burn you out. When these red-hot stones land, they don't just thud into the dirt, they hiss and ignite anything they touch. You see a supply wagon 50 yards away burst into flames as a heated stone finds its way into a crate of dry fodder. The psychological effect is devastating. It's one thing to dodge a rock you can't see. It's another to watch your only source of warmth and food be incinerated by a glowing orb from the heavens. Historians still argue whether the Inca used a specific type of porous volcanic rock that could retain heat longer, or if the fire was entirely due to the external wrappings. But the result was the same, a scorched earth policy delivered at 100 miles per hour. There's a quirky, almost legendary detail in the chronicles about how the Inca captured the Spanish fire. They would observe the Spanish campfires, wait for the perfect moment of wind, and then use their slings to return the fire in the form of these glowing projectiles. It's a bit of dark tactical irony. You provide the heat, and they provide the delivery system. You see a soldier trying to stomp out a small fire started by a stone, only to have 3 more whistling fireflies land around him. They are using the light of the fires they've started to target the men trying to extinguish them. It's a self-sustaining cycle of destruction that turns your own camp into a beacon for the enemy's marksmanship. The scholarly debate often revolves around the phrase, the architecture of ash. During the Great Rebellion, Manco Inca Est forces nearly reclaimed Cusco by systematically burning the city over the heads of the Spanish defenders. They didn't need to storm the walls. They just used their slings to set the thatched roofs of the entire city on fire. You remember the heat being so intense that the Spanish steel armor began to burn the skin of the men wearing it. You were trapped in a metal oven of your own making. This wasn't primitive warfare. It was a sophisticated understanding of logistics and psychology. They knew that a soldier who is fighting a fire cannot hold a sword, and a soldier who is smelling his own supplies burn is a soldier whose morale is already half conquered. You notice that the firestones make a different sound, a low predatory hiss, instead of the clean thrum of the cold stones. It sounds like 1,000 snakes descending from the sky. One of the lighter asides among the men, though, told with trembling lips that the Inca have stolen sun and are throwing pieces of it at you because you've stayed too long in their house. You look at your hands, blackened by soot and trembling from the cold that the fires ironically don't seem to fix. The heated shot strategy effectively extends the battle into the night, denying you the rest you so desperately need. In the dark, the orange arcs are the only thing you can see, making the inevitable thud of the cold stones that follow even more surprising. There's a fringe theory that the Inca actually used a form of chemical warfare by wrapping these heated stones in certain herbs or peppers that, when burned, produced a choking, blinding smoke. Imagine trying to defend a narrow pass while a red-hot stone lands at your feet, erupting in a cloud of capsaicin-laced fumes that turn your lungs into fire. Whether or not it was a widespread practice, the fear of it is enough to make every falling spark feel like a death sentence. You pull your damp cloak over your face, trying to filter the air, but the smoke is everywhere. The Inca are manipulating the very elements earth, air, and fire to force you out of your positions. As you watch the ridge, you see the silhouettes of the firebringers. They work in pairs, one to tend the coals and keep the stones at a dull glow, and the other to loose them with terrifying speed. It's a factory line of destruction. This logistical coordination is what makes the Inca army so formidable. They aren't just individuals with weapons, they are a collective organism. You, on the other hand, are a collection of individuals trying to survive. Your modern cannons would take 10 minutes to cool down and reload. The Inca are sending a firestone every 10 seconds. The wind shifts, blowing the smoke directly into your outcrop. You cough, your eyes stinging, and for a moment, you lose sight of the ridge. That's when you hear the crack of a stone hitting the rock right above your head. It wasn't a firestone. It was a regular one. They used the light of the incendiaries to find your silhouette and the smoke to mask their aim. It's a level of tactical synergy that makes your head spin. They are playing with you, using the heated shot not just for destruction, but as a giant flickering lantern to illuminate their targets. The sky is a bruised purple-black, lit by the flickering orange of a dozen small fires. You realize that out here, under the gaze of the mountain gods, your steel is just a conductor for heat, and your gunpowder is just a ticking time bomb. The rhythmic thrum has returned to its steady, cold cadence, but the memory of the fire stays with you. You are being hunted by a force that has mastered the very core of the earth to drive you into the dark. You huddle closer to the cold stone, ironically wishing for a bit of that Inca fire, even as you pray it doesn't find you. As the glow of the incendiary stones fades into a dull ember, you start to wonder where it all comes from. How can an army in the middle of a desolate, vertical wasteland sustain such a relentless barrage? The answer lies just a few miles down the trail at the nearest tambo. These aren't just roadside inns. They are the specialized gears of the most impressive logistical machine the world has ever seen. You've seen them squat, sturdy stone buildings perched on the edges of cliffs, but you probably didn't. T realized they were packed to the rafters with millions of standardized river stones. Mainstream historians emphasize the Inca road network, the Capac own, but for the soldier on the ground. The roads were merely a delivery system for the contents of these storehouses. While you are struggling to find a single clean lead ball in your pouch, the Inca warrior knows that no matter how many stones he looses, there are 10,000 more waiting in a bin less than a day's march away. This is the logistics of the tambo, a state-managed munitions program that makes your European supply lines look like a chaotic mess. To the Spanish Empire, supply means waiting for a ship to cross the Atlantic, hoping it doesn't sink, and then hauling crates up thousands of feet on the backs of mules that keep dying of exhaustion. To the Sapa Inca, supply is a ritualized tax. Every village along the road is responsible for keeping the tambo filled. Historians still argue whether there were specific quotas for sling stones, but archaeological finds of massive stone piles near these structures suggest a staggering level of preparation. You probably wouldn't survive the mental toll of knowing that your enemy has a virtually infinite magazine, while every shot you fire is a non-renewable resource. There's a quirky, almost obsessive detail found in some of the early Spanish administrative records. They were baffled by the piles of smooth rocks they found in captured storehouses. They initially thought they were for building repairs, but a veteran of the highlands would have known better. Those weren't for building. Those were for breaking. Some fringe theories even suggest the Inca had a color-coded storage system, where stones of different weights or mineral densities were kept in separate bins to be distributed based on the tactical needs of the coming campaign. Imagine an Inca quartermaster handing out bags of armor-piercing hematite stones as if they were rations of dried llama meat. It's a level of military-industrial integration that wouldn't be seen in Europe for centuries. You find yourself looking at the heft of your own equipment. Your sword is chipped, your armor is dented, and your arquebus is jammed with grit. Maintenance for you is a nightmare. For the Inca, maintenance is picking up a new sling and a fresh bag of stones. One of the lighthearted jokes among the Spanish infantry, though it's the kind of joke that comes with a hollow stares, that the Inca are the only army in the world that can eat their environment to stay armed. You're fighting a force that is literally integrated into the geology of the continent. The tambo system ensures that a retreating Inca force doesn't get weaker. They get stronger, falling back onto fresh supplies, while you get further and further away from your own. The scholarly debate often uses the term the imperial cord, referring to how the road and storehouse system acted as the nervous system of the empire. This allowed the Inca to move thousands of slingers across vast distances without the need for a massive baggage train. Each slinger carries his weaponicord wrapped around his head end. His ammunition is waiting for him at the next stop. You, meanwhile, are slowed down by wagons, livestock, and servants. In the time it takes you to move a mile, the Inca light infantry has moved 5, refilled their pouches at a tambo, and set up an ambush on the next ridge. You are a slow-moving target in a world where speed is everything. You notice that the stones currently hitting your shield have a consistent gray-blue hue. You realize with a start that these are the exact same type of stones you saw in a pile near a storehouse 10 miles back. They are standardized. This isn't just throwing rocks. This is a calibrated weapon system. The consistency of the ammunition means the slinger doesn't have to adjust for the feel of each stone. His muscle memory is perfectly synced with the weight and drag of the projectile. It's the same principle as modern match-grade ammunition. You're being targeted by an army that understands the importance of a predictable ballistic trajectory. There's a fringe theory that the tambos also acted as training hubs, where soldiers could practice their aim against specific targets while they rested. As you hunker down, you imagine a line of warriors standing outside a stone building, laughing as they knock small clay pots off a wall from 100 paces. They are turning their downtime into a lethal refinement of their skills. You, meanwhile, are spending your downtime trying to patch your boots and praying that your teeth stop rattling from the cold. The disparity in warrior readiness is becoming a chasm that you can't see a way across. As the wind whistles through the pass, you hear the distant rhythmic clack-clack of stones being moved. Is it the wind? Or is it a fresh unit of slingers arriving from the nearest tambo, their pouches heavy with 1,000 new deaths? The logistical might of the empire is a weight that presses down on you harder than the thin air. You realize that you aren't just fighting the men on the ridge, you're fighting the thousands of people who gathered these stones, the weavers who made the slings, and the architects who built the storehouses. You're fighting an entire civilization that has been designed from the ground up to keep those stones flying. The rhythmic thrum starts up again, but this time it sounds different, fuller, more confident. The logistics of the tambo have delivered. A fresh wave of ammunition has reached the front line, and you are the only thing standing in its way. You pull your shield closer, feeling the weight of the steel and the lightness of your hope. Out here, in the shadow of the peaks, the man with the most stones is the man who writes the history. And looking at the ground around you, it's clear who that's going to be. The sun has dipped behind the furthest peak, and the mountain is swallowed by a deep indigo shadow. In the sudden gloom, the visual cues you relied on to track the incoming stones have vanished. But a new sensation takes their place, a sound that makes the hair on your arms stand up. It's a high-pitched warbling scream that cuts through the thin air like a banshee. This is the psychological warfare of the whistling stone. You've heard the regular stones, their low-frequency thrum, but these are different. These are stones that have been intentionally modified, carved with small, hollow notches, or drilled with precise flute-like holes. When loosed from a warak'a, At terminal velocity, the air rushing through these cavities creates a terrifying predatory shriek. It's a sound designed for one purpose: to break your mind before the stone breaks your body. Mainstream historical accounts from the siege of Cusco mention that the Spanish were deeply unsettled by the singing of the Inca projectiles. It wasn't just the noise, it was the fact that you couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. In the narrow canyons, the whistle echoes and bounces, making it seem as if the air itself is screaming at you from every direction. You probably wouldn't survive the mental strain of a prolonged night engagement with these. It's a form of acoustic disorientation that targets the human startle reflex. Just as you think you've braced yourself, a stone shrieks past your ear, the sound lingering in your auditory canal like a ghost. Historians still argue whether the Inca used these specifically to signal unit movements or purely as a terror tactic. But in the dark, the distinction is irrelevant. There's a quirky, most macabre detail in the fringe literature suggesting that the pitch of the whistle was sometimes tuned to the resonance of a human scream. Imagine being trapped in a ravine, surrounded by the souls of the mountain, each one howling as it seeks out your skull. One of the light-hearted or perhaps desperate jokes among your company is that the Inca Dantí even needs stones. They could just throw the sound at you and you'd die of a heart attack. You see a veteran soldier, a man who survived the wars in Italy, shaking uncontrollably. It's not the threat of impact, it's the noise. The whistle triggers a primitive fear of the unseen. It's the predator in the grass translated into a ballistic reality. The scholarly debate regarding the haunting of the highlands focuses on how the Inca used the environment to amplify these psychological effects. They knew that at night, when the wind dies down, the acoustics of the Andes are preternaturally clear. A single whistling stone can sound like a dozen. This allows a small group of skirmishers to mimic the presence of a much larger force, keeping you pinned and paranoid while the main army repositions. You're fighting a phantom army that uses the laws of physics to play with your perception. You find yourself swinging your sword at shadows, wasting energy and oxygen on threats that don't exist, while the real danger remains silent and stationary on the ridge. You notice that the whistling stones are often used in a specific sequence. A few screamers are sent first to make you duck and cover, and then the silent killers, the smooth, uncarved river stones, follow immediately after. It's a classic baton switch. You're so focused on the noise that you lose track of the actual projectiles. You watch a man next to you peek over his shield to find the source of a whistle, only to be struck in the chest by a silent stone he never saw coming. It's a surgical application of sensory overload. The Inca aren't just master slingers. They are master psychologists of the battlefield. There is a fringe theory that some of these stones were carved to represent the voices of specific deities like Illapa, the god of thunder and lightning. To the Inca, the crack and scream of the sling were the earthly manifestations of divine power. When they threw a whistling stone, they weren't just attacking a soldier. They were performing a ritual of territorial purification. You are the impurity being driven out by the voice of the mountain. This spiritual layer adds a level of fanaticism to their accuracy. They aren't just aiming, they are fulfilling a cosmic mandate. You, meanwhile, are just trying to remember the Latin words to a prayer you haven't said in years. As the night deepens, you realize that the psychological warfare is working. Every rustle of the wind, every shift of a pebble, sounds like the start of a new shriek. Your sleep-deprived brain is starting to hallucinate. You see the faces of the slingers in the crags of the rocks. One of the common jokes whispered in the darkest that the Inca have taught the rocks how to hate. It's a chilling thought. You feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on you, and the whistle becomes a constant, low-grade tinnitus in your ears. You are being softened for a blow that hasn't even landed yet. The geometry of fear is a phrase sometimes used to describe the way the Inca positioned their slingers. By placing men at different heights and angles, they can create a stereo whistling effect. You hear a high-pitched scream from the left, a low-pitched moan from the right, and a sharp chirp from above. It feels as if you are being circled by a pack of invisible wolves. This is the ultimate force multiplier. A few dozen men can sound like 1,000, and 1,000 can sound like the end of the world. You pull your cloak tighter, but it does nothing to block out the sound. The rhythmic thrum has been replaced by this chaotic, shrieking symphony. You realize that your steel armor provides no protection against sound. Your shield can stop a stone, but it can't stop the terror that the whistling inspires. The Inca have mastered the air itself, turning the very medium of your breath into a weapon of psychological annihilation. You sit there, trembling in the indigo dark, waiting for the next scream to tear through the silence, knowing that each whistle is a promise that the mountain is watching and the mountain is hungry. The indigo dark of the mountainside fades into the memory of the greatest urban nightmare of the conquest, the siege of Cusco. You weren't just hiding behind a rock then. You were trapped in a city of stone that had been turned into a giant, multi-layered kill zone. Manco Inca, the rebel emperor, who had finally seen through the myth of Spanish invincibility, brought nearly 200,000 warriors to the hills surrounding the capital. Standing on the ramparts of the Sacsayhuaman fortress, you looked out and saw a sight that haunted your dreams for a decade, a literal sea of warriors. And at the front of every battalion were the slingers. This was the largest sling-based military operation in human history, and it was a masterpiece of tactical coordination. Mainstream history often focuses on the hand-to-hand combat in the narrow streets. But it was the rain of stones that dictated the pace of the battle. The Inca didn't just charge the walls. They used the heights to deliver a continuous, suppressing fire that made it impossible for you to man the defenses. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer volume of that bombardment. The chroniclers noted that the sky over Cusco was never empty. As soon as one volley landed, another was in the air. This wasn't just harassment, it was a sustained artillery barrage. The Inca had mastered the rolling volley, where different units timed their releases to ensure that at any given millisecond, hundreds of stones were impacting the city. Historians still argue whether Manco Inca used a signal tower system to direct this fire, but you remember the rhythm of it. It felt like being under a physical weight. One of the quirky, terrifying tidbits from the siege was the Spanish realization that their horses were becoming more of a liability than an asset within the city walls. In the narrow, cobblestone streets, a slinger perched on a flat roof had a god's eye view of your cavalry. They didn't aim for the riders. They aimed for the horses' legs. You saw a dozen noble stallions go down in a single afternoon, their shins shattered by stones that ricocheted off the stone walls like lethal pinballs. The city, built by the Inca, was being used as a force multiplier against you. Every wall was a surface for a ricochet. Every roof was a sniper's nest. The scholarly debate phrase "the attrition of the heights" perfectly describes those months. You were trapped in the valley floor, while the Inca held the ridges. This meant that every stone they threw gained velocity and punching power as it descended the 500 feet from the cliffs into the plaza. By the time a stone reached your level, it had the kinetic profile of a modern lead slug. You saw a stone hit a stone fountain in the center of the square, and the fountain didn't just chip, it exploded into shards. The message was clear. There was no safe place in Cusco. Even the architecture was being pulverized around you. There's a light-hearted, if slightly crazed, bit of gallows humor that emerged among the besieged Spaniards. They began to call the stones Inca Hail, UDC men running from building to building with their shields held over their heads like umbrellas, trying to avoid a storm that never ended. But unlike hail, these stones didn't melt. They piled up in the streets, making it impossible to move the heavy cannons or even to run without twisting an ankle. The Inca were literally filling in the city with ammunition. They were burying you under the weight of the Andes, one riverstone at a time. You notice a specific tactic being used during the breach of the fortress. The slingers weren't just firing at the men on the walls. They were firing at the crenels, the gaps in the battlements. They were so accurate that if you even peeked out to aim your crossbow, a stone would whistle through the gap and take your head off. It was a level of suppressive fire that would be seen again until the age of the machine gun. You were forced to fire blindly, lofting your bolts into the air and hoping for the best, while the Inca were picking their targets with surgical precision. This is why the siege lasted so long. You were physically prevented from using your superior range because the suppression zone was absolute. There is a fringe theory that Manco Inca actually had a corps of engineers who spent the nights before the big pushes, moving massive piles of stones to the very edge of the cliffs, just so the slingers wouldn't have to carry them during the fight. Imagine the logistical terror. You look up at dawn and see that the ridgeline has physically changed shape because there are now mountains of ammunition waiting for you. You realize that you aren't just fighting an army. You're fighting a state that has mobilized every resource for your destruction. The rhythmic thrum of the slings became the soundtrack of the siege, a heartbeat that told you the city was no longer yours. As the sun sets over the smoking ruins of the city, You realize that the siege of Cusco was the moment the New World proved it could stand toe-to-toe with the old. The sling, a weapon thousands of years old, had neutralized the horse, the sword, and the gun. You saw Spanish knights, men who had fought in the greatest battles of Europe, weeping with frustration because they couldn't even reach the enemy. They were being beaten by children's toys and shepherd's tools. But you knew better. You had felt the kinetic energy of those tools. You had seen the Morion helmets caved in. The wind whistles through the broken thatch of the roof you're hiding under, and for a second, it sounds exactly like a whistling stone. You flinch, your heart racing. The siege of Cusco ended, but the trauma of the Rain of Stones never did. You realize that the Inca didn't lose that battle because their weapons failed. They lost because of the internal politics of their own empire. But as far as the physics of war was concerned, the warak'a was the undisputed king of the mountain. You look at your dented shield, a souvenir of those terrible months, and you know that you were lucky to be breathing at all. As you reflect on the chaos of the city streets, you realize that the most feared weapon in the Spanish arsenal, the horse, had met its match in the simplest of ways. You remember the pride of the Spanish cavalry, the caballeros, who believed a mounted charge could break any infantry line in the world. But here in the vertical world, the horse's greatest strength became its most tragic vulnerability. You re-watching from the edge of a ravine as a small troop of your fellow riders attempts to flank an Inca position. The horses are majestic, powerful, and utterly out of their element. You see an Inca slinger on the opposite slope. He doesn't aim for the rider's chest or the shiny steel of the breastplate. He aims low. He aims for the thin, brittle bones of the horse's legs. Mainstream history often attributes the Spanish success to their superior cavalry, but the tactical reality was a brutal game of limb-shattering physics. A horse's leg is a masterpiece of biology, but it is also a structural nightmare in a high-velocity projectile environment. When a half-pound river stone, traveling at terminal velocity, strikes the cannon bone or the pastern of a galloping horse, the result is instantaneous. There is no glancing blow. The kinetic energy is dumped directly into the bone, which snaps like a dry twig. You probably wouldn't. T survived the resulting fall. Being pinned under a 500-pound animal while sliding down a scree slope is a recipe for a crushed pelvis or a broken neck. You watch as a stallion's front leg simply buckles, the animal cartwheeling into the dust while the slinger is already winding up for the next shot. Historians still argue whether the Inca had specific anti-cavalry units trained solely to target animals, but the clinical efficiency of their fire suggests a deep understanding of Spanish logistics. A knight without a horse is just a very slow, very hot man in a metal suit. There's a quirky, dark observation from the early chroniclers. The Inca began to view the horse and rider as a single, multi-legged monster, and they realized that if you broke one leg, the whole monster died. You see a slinger perform a low sweeping throw with a skip shot. We talked about earlier where the stone bounces off the flat rock and flies upward into the horse's underbelly or knees. It's a surgical level of cruelty that effectively neutralized the primary advantage of the European invaders. The scholarly debate often touches on the phrase, the shattering of the centaur. For the first few months of the conquest, the Inca were terrified of the giant deer the Spaniards rode. But by the time of the Great Rebellions, that fear had turned into a calculated tactical response. You notice that the slingers have learned to time their volleys with the horse's gait. They wait for the moment when the animal's weight is fully committed to a single limb, and then they strike. It's a display of timing and marksmanship that makes your heart sink. Your tanks are being dismantled by pebbles. You've seen noblemen weeping over their dead chargers, not just out of grief, but out of the realization that they are now trapped on foot in a land that belongs to the mountain goats. There's a light-hearted, if bitter joke among the infantry. A horse costs 1,000 gold pesos, but an Inca stone is free. It's a mathematical problem that the Spanish treasury couldn't solve. Every time a horse was broken by a sling, the Spanish lost a piece of their mobile sovereignty. You look at the ground around the fallen horse and see the ammunition that did the deed. 3 or 4 perfectly smooth stones, looking innocent and still. They don't look like they could stop a war horse, but the laws of motion don't care about appearances. Momentum equals mass times velocity, and at these speeds, the mass of a river stone is more than enough to overcome the structural integrity of biological tissue. You notice the riders are trying to adapt. They've started wrapping the horse's legs in thick layers of quilted cotton, similar to the Inca armor. It looks ridiculous, like the horses are wearing oversized socks, but it's a desperate attempt to dampen the impact. However, even the thickest cotton can only do so much against a direct hit. The thrum of the slings follows the cavalry everywhere, a constant reminder that their mobility is a fragile gift. You see a captain order his men to dismount and lead their horses by the bridle, effectively surrendering their tactical edge just to keep their animals alive. The Inca hail has turned the masters of the plains into cautious, limping pedestrians. There's a fringe theory that the Inca actually used ball-style slings to stones connected by a cord specifically to entangle the legs of the horses. While most archaeological evidence points to the traditional single-pouch warak'a, the fear of being tripped by the sky was a very real psychological weight for the riders. You imagine the terror of a horse feeling its legs bound, while a dozen regular stones are still whistling toward its head. The Inca aren't just trying to kill the animal, they are trying to create a collision event. They want the chaos of a fallen horse to break the formation of the entire unit. As the sun sets, you see the remains of the troop retreating. 2 men are sharing a single horse, and another is walking beside his limping mount, his hand on its neck. They look defeated, not by a great army, but by the relentless geometry of the mountains. The rhythmic thrum of the slings continues from the heights, a steady, mocking cadence. You realize that the horse, for all its power, is a sea level creature. It wasn't built for these angles, and it certainly wasn't built to withstand the kinetic fury of the warak'a. Your centaur has been shattered, leaving you exposed and heavy on the thin, cold earth. The wind picks up, and the scent of the dying horse reaches you, a mixture of sweat, blood, and the dry dust of the trail. It's the smell of a failing empire. You pull your cloak tighter, feeling the vulnerability of your own legs. If they can do that to a stallion, what can they do to you? You realize that out here, the only way to survive is to be as small and as fast as the stones themselves. But you are draped in steel and burdened by history, while the Inca are as light as the wind and as patient as the rock. The reality of your survival in the Andes begins to reshape you, quite literally, from the outside in. You're standing in a small camp, watching a veteran soldier peel off his expensive, dented breastplate and toss it into a corner with a sound of pure disgust. In its place, he pulls on a thick, heavy tunic made of quilted cotton. It looks bulky, almost comical, like he's wearing a mattress. But you've seen enough to know he isn't losing his mind. He's saving his life. This is the evolution of the armor, the moment where European military pride finally broke under the relentless pressure of Inca physics. You probably wouldn't survive another week in the high passes if you clung to your steel. Because you've realized that while steel is great for stopping a sword, it is a conductor for the bone-shattering vibrations of a slingstone. Mainstream history often glosses over this tactical surrender. But by the mid-1530s, the Spanish look had fundamentally changed. The steel morion was increasingly replaced by reinforced fabric caps or hardwood helmets, and the heavy breastplate was traded for layers of salt-soaked quilted cotton nearly 3 fingers thick. You see, the cotton works like a modern bulletproof vest. It doesn't try to be harder than the stone, it tries to be smarter. When the stone hits the soft, multi-layered fibers, the energy is dissipated through the layers of the quilt rather than being transmitted in a single skull-crushing shockwave to your ribs. Historians still argue whether the Spanish learned this specifically from the Inca or from their earlier experiences with the Aztecs in Mexico, but in the Andes, it became a matter of basic biological necessity. There's a quirky, almost absurd detail in the journals of the era. Spanish soldiers started to complain that they looked more like padded dolls than knights of the Reconquista, but the complaints stopped the moment the first stone hit. You watch a man take a direct hit to the chest while wearing the cotton. He stumbles, he loses his breath, but his ribs stay intact. If he'd been wearing steel, that stone would have caved the metal inward, creating a jagged edge that would have punctured his lung. You realize that out here, advanced is a relative term. The primitive cotton is the high-tech solution for this specific ballistic environment. It's a humbling lesson in materials science. Sometimes, flexibility is a greater defense than rigidity. The scholarly debate often centers on the phrase, the indigenization of the conquistador. It wasn't just the armor, it was the entire way you carried yourself. You've noticed that your comrades are moving differently, now lower to the ground. Using the cotton's lightness to mimic the agility of the Inca, you're no longer a lumbering tank. You're trying to become a skirmisher. However, there's a lighthearted irony to this. The cotton armor is incredibly hot, and when it gets wet in the Andean rain, it weighs twice as much as the steel ever did. You look at your friends, dripping with sweat and smelling like damp sheep, and you realize that every tactical advantage comes with a price. You've traded the risk of a crushed skull for the certainty of a permanent itchy heat rash. You notice that the Inca slingers have caught on to your change in gear. They've adjusted their aim again. Since the cotton protects the torso so well, they are now targeting the face and the fitarius, where you can easily wrap yourself in quilts. This is the constant arms race of the highlands. You add a flap of leather to your cap. They switch to heavier, jagged stones designed to rip through the fabric. It's a game of move and counter-move played out across the ravines. One of the common jokes among the men is that by the time this war is over, you'll all be wrapped in so much wool, you'll be mistaken for llamas and sheared by the locals. It's a dark bit of humor, but it keeps the fear at bay for a few minutes. There's a fringe theory that the Spanish actually started reinforcing their cotton armor with small plates of scavenged Inca copper, creating a hybrid brigandine style. You see a soldier sewing a series of small, overlapping metal scales into the lining of his tunic. It's a desperate attempt to have the best of both worlds, the hardness of metal and the dampening effect of the cloth. Whether it works or not is a matter of luck. You see a stone hit a man wearing one of these hybrids. The copper scale shatters, but it prevents the stone from sinking deep into his gut. He lives to fight another day, but he'll be picking bits of copper out of his skin for a month. As the wind howls through the pass, you feel the thrum of the slings again. Even with your new armor, the sound still makes your stomach drop. The evolution of the armor is a testament to how much the Inca forced you to change. They took the pride of Europe, the armored knight-hand, stripped him down until he was just another man in a wool shirt, fighting for air in the high peaks. You look at your old steel helmet, now being used as a cooking pot near the fire, and you realize that the Andes have a way of recycling everything. The mountain doesn't care about your titles or your smiths. It only cares about what can withstand the weight of a stone. You pull your quilted collar up around your neck, feeling the coarse, salty texture of the fabric. It's not beautiful, and it's certainly not noble, but it feels like a second skin. You've accepted that the steel mythos was a lie, told by men who had never seen a warak'a in action. Out here, you are a creature of the mountains now, wrapped in the same fibers as your enemy, breathing the same thin air and waiting for the same inevitable whistling in the dark. The transformation is almost complete. You are no longer an invader from across the sea. You are a survivor of the Rain of Stones. The rhythmic thrum starts up again, but this time, you don't just cower. You adjust your padded shoulders, brace your feet in the dust, and wait. You know what's coming, and for the first time, you feel like you might actually have a chance to see the sunrise. The cotton is heavy, the air is thin, but your heart is still beating. And in the land of the four quarters, that is the only victory that matters. You're sitting there, fingers tracing the coarse weave of your new quilted armor. And you find yourself obsessing over the physics of the enemy's delivery. You've seen how the stones don't just fly, they seem to drill through the air. This is the secret of the spin, a concept that European ballistics wouldn't fully codify for another century, but which the Inca have mastered through sheer tactile intuition. When you watch a slinger on the ridge, his wrist doesn't just open to let the stone go. There is a subtle whip-cracking flick at the exact moment of release or rifling motion that imparts a massive amount of backspin or sidespin on the river stone. This spin stabilizes the projectile in flight, much like a modern bullet spiraling down a rifled barrel, allowing it to resist the buffeting Andean winds and maintain a flatter, more predictable trajectory over incredible distances. Mainstream historians often focus on the power of the throw, but it's the aerodynamic stability provided by the spin that makes the Inca sling so much more lethal than a simple rock toss. Because the stone is spinning, it benefits from the Magnus effect of physical phenomenon, where a spinning object creates a whirlpool of air around itself, experiencing lift or a curve depending on the axis of the spin. You probably wouldn't survive a duel with a marksman who knows how to curve a stone around your shield. You've seen it happen. A soldier braces his buckler to the front, only for a stone to hook sharply to the left in midair, striking him in the unprotected temple. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate, taught technique or an instinctive mastery of the tool, but the result is a projectile that defies the linear expectations of your European training. There's a quirky, almost obsessive detail in the way the Inca select their stones to facilitate this spin. They look for prolate spheroid stones that are slightly longer than they are wide, like a small, dense lemon. This shape allows the pouch of the warak'a to grip the stone along its longitudinal axis, ensuring that when the flick occurs, the spin is centered and balanced. If the stone wobbles, it loses energy and accuracy. You watch a slinger test a stone by spinning it between his thumb and forefinger, checking its balance like a gambler checking a pair of dice. One of the light-hearted asides among your company is that the Inca don't just throw rocks, they tame them, teaching them how to fly straight through a land that is anything but. The scholarly debate often utilizes the phrase, the ballistics of the wrist. While your arquebus relies on the explosion of powder to force a ball through a tube, the Inca used the kinetic chain of the entire human body to impart energy. The spin acts as a gyroscope, keeping the stone's orientation consistent, despite the thinning air and the gusty mountain passes. You notice that the thrum we talked about so much is actually the sound of the spin the stone biting into the air as it rotates thousands of times per minute. It's a specialized form of engineering that uses biological muscle to achieve mechanical results. You realize that your modern weapons are actually quite crude by comparison. They rely on raw force, whereas the sling relies on the sophisticated manipulation of fluid dynamics. You've tried to imitate the motion, picking up a discarded sling in a stone during a quiet moment. But the moment you try that final flick, the stone either slips out early and hits your own foot, or stays in too long and flies directly into the ground. It's a reminder that this secret of the spin isn't just a trick, it's a lifetime of calibration. You probably wouldn't survive the years of practice required to keep the stone from tumbling. A tumbling stone loses its velocity rapidly due to drag, but a spinning stone pierces the atmosphere. One of the common jokes told with the wince is that the Inca could throw a stone through a keyhole if you gave them 3 tries to find the wind. There's a fringe theory that the Inca used different types of braid friction to enhance this spin. By weaving different textures into the cuna or pouch, they could create more grip on the stone's surface, allowing for a more violent rotation upon release. Imagine a weapon where the very fabric it's made of is designed to act as a high-friction tire for the projectile. You see a warrior rubbing his sling pouch with a bit of sticky resin or plant sap. He's not just cleaning it, he's tuning it. He's ensuring that when that cord snaps, the stone doesn't just leave. It launches with a rotational velocity that makes it a miniature buzzsaw in the air. As the wind picks up, you see the effect of the spin in real time. A heavy gust blows across the pass, the kind of wind that would send a crossbow bolt veering off target by several feet. But the sling stones keep coming, cutting through the crosswind with a terrifying gyrostabilized precision. They don't drift, they drill. You realize that the primitive weapon is actually a masterclass in aerodynamics. The Inca have solved the problem of wind resistance using nothing but wool and a flick of the wrist. It's a humbling realization that your old-world science is being outclassed by an intuitive understanding of the very air you breathe. The rhythmic thrum feels different now that you understand the spin. It sounds more intentional, more mechanical. You look at the warrior on the ridge, his arm a blur of motion, and you see the snap of his wrist at the apex of the arc. It's a beautiful, lethal movement. He's not just an athlete, he's a ballistician, and you are the target in his laboratory. You pull your quilted hood tighter, feeling the vulnerability of your neck. Even with the best armor, the secret of the spin means that the stone won't just hit you, it will bite into the fabric, trying to find a way through to the bone. The sun is a sliver on the horizon, and the shriek of the whistling stones returns. Now augmented by the knowledge of their spin, you realize that the Inca haven't just mastered the mountain, they've mastered the physics of the void. They turned a piece of string into a rifled barrel and a river stone into a precision-guided munition. You sit in the deepening shadow, listening to the air being carved into pieces by the secret of the spin. And you wonder if there's anything in your world that can truly stand against it. You're staring out across the vast rocky expanse of the Andean Plateau, and for the first time, you truly appreciate the scale of the distance. You look at a jagged pillar of rock about 300 yards away, a length of 3 modern football fields, and you see a puff of dust erupts from its center. A split second later, the crack of the impact reaches your ears. It's a sobering realization. In Europe, a distance of 300 yards is the realm of heavy artillery or specialized longbowmen. But here, It is the effective range of a man with a piece of wool. This is where the range comparisons and modern tests finally shatter your illusions of technological superiority. Your arquebus, while loud and intimidating, is practically a melee weapon compared to the reach of a master slinger. If you were to stand at that 300-yard mark and try to hit a target with your firearm, you'd be lucky to hit the right mountain, let alone a specific person. Mainstream historical ballistics often underestimate the sling because modern recreations are rarely performed by people who have trained since childhood. However, modern tests using high-speed cameras and professional traditional slingers have confirmed that a river stone can maintain lethal velocity well past the 200-meter mark. You probably wouldn't survive the dead zone between your maximum range and theirs. As you trudge forward, you are under fire for a full 2 minutes before you are even close enough to consider leveling your own weapon. Historians still argue whether the Inca had range markers, piles of white stones placed at specific intervals to help slingers judge the drop butt. Looking at the precision of the stones falling around you, it's clear they don't need them. Their eyes have been calibrated by the horizon itself. There's a quirky, almost unbelievable detail from modern experimental archaeology. Some testers have found that at long ranges, a sling stone actually retains its killing power better than an early lead bullet because the stone is denser and has more mass. It doesn't lose momentum to air resistance as quickly as a small, light projectile. You see a stone skip off the ground near your feet. It's still moving with enough force to break an ankle, even though it was launched from a ridge you can barely see. One of the light-hearted jokes among the few Spanish survivors who made it back to the coast was that the Inca don't shoot at you. They mail the stones to you, and they always arrive on time. It's a bitter way to describe a weapon that turns the entire landscape into a shooting gallery. The scholarly debate, phrased "the tyranny of the arc," describes the tactical nightmare you are currently living through. Because the sling stone travels in a high looping trajectory, it can be lobbed over obstacles that would stop a direct fire weapon like a gun or a crossbow. You can hide behind a wall, but the stones just rain down from above, guided by gravity and the relentless math of the slinger's release. You've seen men huddled in what they thought was dead space behind a ridge, only to be pelted by a vertical barrage that they couldn't possibly dodge. You notice that at these extreme ranges, the slingers are using a different technique, much wider, slower rotation that looks more like a hammer throw. They are using the extra time to build up massive centrifugal force. You watch a stone the size of a man's fist fall from the sky, striking a supply mule with a sound like a falling tree. The animal collapses instantly. It's not just a weapon, it's a force of nature. You realize that your firearms are built for the flat, cramped battlefields of Flanders, while the sling was built for the infinite verticality of the Andes. There is a fringe theory that the Inca military actually held range finding, drills where they would practice hitting targets across deep valleys, learning how to account for the updrafts and downdrafts of the mountain winds. Imagine a warrior who knows exactly how much a thermal pocket will lift his stone. It's a level of environmental integration that makes your scientific ballistics look like guesswork. You feel like a man trying to play a game of chess while the other player is playing with the board, the pieces, and the very air in the room. Every time you think you've found a safe distance, a stone hums past your ear to prove you wrong. As you walk the distance of those 3 football fields in your mind, you realize how many steps it takes to close the gap. Every step is a second where you are a target. Every step is a heartbeat where the thrum of the sling is the only thing you hear. You look back at your own lines and see how small and vulnerable they look from this distance. The Inca don't need to be brave. They just need to be patient. They can sit on their ridges, out of reach of your steel and your smoke, and slowly dismantle your expedition stone by stone. The range comparison isn't just a matter of meters, it's a matter of who owns the space between the armies. One of the common jokes whispered among the scouts is that the Spanish brought a yardstick to a war that is measured in leagues. You're fighting in a world that is too big for your weapons. You see a slinger on a distant peak, a tiny speck against the blue sky, and you watch the glint of his arm moving. 10 seconds later, the air near you erupts in a spray of gravel. He's not even trying to hit you anymore. He's just reminding you that he can. It's a psychological dominance that is reinforced by every yard of distance that your weapons won't cover. The sun is high now, casting short, harsh shadows that make the distances seem even more deceptive. You realize that the Inca hail doesn't just fall in the valley. It covers the entire world. There is no out of range in the Andes, there is only not yet targeted. You pull your quilted hood tighter, feeling the immense weight of the 300 yards of open ground ahead of you. It's a long way to walk when the sky is full of whistling stones. And you're starting to suspect that you'll never reach the other side. As the sun reaches its zenith, the light reflecting off the White River stones scattered around you takes on a brilliant, almost divine quality. You aren't just looking at ammunition anymore. You are looking at the sacred messengers of Illapa, the god of thunder, lightning, and rain. To the Inca, the crack of a sling isn't just a physical phenomenon, it's the earthly echo of the heavens. You remember hearing a captive explain that the roar of the thunder is the sound of Illapa's sling being swung. Across the sky and the lightning is the flash of his golden tunic as he looses a stone to crack the celestial water jug, bringing rain to the parched earth. Standing here with the thrum of the warak'a vibrating in your chest, the line between military technology and religious ritual begins to blur. You realize that for the warriors on the ridge, this isn't just a battle, it is an act of worship. Mainstream historians often separate the spiritual from the tactical, but in the Andes, they are one and the same. The sling, or warak'a, was a ritual object as much as a weapon. You've noticed that some of the slings used by the elite guards are decorated with parrot feathers and intricate gold threads that sparkle in the light. These weren't for show, they were consecrated tools. You probably wouldn't survive the mental shift required to understand that. To your enemy, every hit they score is a sign of divine favor. When a stone crushes a Spanish helmet, the Inca don't just see a successful ballistic strike, they see Illapa striking down an intruder who has offended the natural order. This religious conviction gives them a morale that your priests, with their talk of distant saints and abstract heavens, can't quite match. Historians still argue whether the Inca timed their greatest volleys to coincide with thunderstorms to amplify this psychological effect. You remember a skirmish near Vilcashomen, where a sudden Andean storm broke over the pass just as the first stones began to fall. The synchronized crack of the slings and the boom of the thunder made it feel as if the mountain itself were screaming at you. It's a quirky, terrifying bit of cultural synergy. One of the lighthearted or perhaps soulsick jokes among the Spanish veterans is that the Inca have God on video, and he's a better marksman than any of us. You see a man drop to his knees and start crossing himself, not because of the stones, but because the coincidental timing of the lightning feels like a targeted judgment. The scholarly debate phrase, the liturgy of the stone, captures how the very act of slinging was integrated into the Inca calendar. During the festival of Chichua, intended to drive out disease and evil spirits, warriors would swing their slings and shout to the winds. You realize you are being treated as one of those evil spirits. You aren't an army to be defeated. You are a sickness to be expelled from the land. This changes the way they fight you. They don't want to negotiate. They want to cleanse the pass. You watch a slinger pause to touch his stone to his forehead before loading itamucha, or kiss of respect, to the spirit of the rock. This isn't the cold, mechanical warfare of Europe. It's a high-stakes exorcism. There's a fringe theory that the whistling stones we talked about were actually designed to mimic the voice of specific wakas' sacred mountain spirits. By using them, the Inca were literally summoning the mountain to speak its displeasure. You hear a high-pitched warble that sounds remarkably like a bird of prey, and you see the warriors on the ridge stand straighter, as if emboldened by the sound. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer weight of this cultural atmosphere if you stayed here too long. It feels as if the very rocks under your feet are taking sides. You find yourself looking at a simple river stone with a newfound dread. It's not just a projectile, it's a piece of a god's body sent to remove you from existence. You notice that the rhythmic thrum has a hypnotic quality to it, similar to the drumming you've heard in the highland villages during the solar festivals. The slingers are moving in a trance-like state, their breathing perfectly synced with the rotation of their arms. This is the selection of the chosen training coming full circle. They have been taught that their strength is not their own, but a gift from the peaks. One of the common jokes, whispered by the campfire to ward off the darkest, that the Inca do want to get tired because the wind does the work for them. It's a way of processing the impossible endurance of a man who can throw stones for 6 hours without stopping. As the afternoon shadows begin to pool in the craters of the valley, you see a group of priests among the warriors, burning coca leaves and pouring libations of Chichime's beer onto the ground. They are feeding the earth before the earth feeds on you. This ritual preparation makes the coming volley feel inevitable. like the setting of the sun. You realize that your steel mythos was built on the idea of human superiority, but the Inca stone mythos is built on the idea of human integration with the divine. You are fighting a war against a theology, and your swords can't cut a belief system. The thrumming starts up again, but it sounds heavier now, more resonant. You look at the sky, half expecting to see Ilapa himself leaning over the ridge. The religious significance of the sling turns every stone into a sacred bullet. You pull your quilted hood over your head, but it feels like a poor shield against the wrath of a thunder god. You realize that in the Andes, the weapon is never just a weapon. It is a bridge between the world of men and the world of spirits. And right now, that bridge is being used to drop half-pound river stones directly onto your head. The wind picks up, carrying the scent of wood smoke and ritual incense. You feel a sudden sharp pang of loneliness. You are thousands of miles from your own cathedrals, standing in a temple made of granite and sky, where the only music is the scream of the stones. The rhythmic thrum reaches a crescendo, and for a moment, the air feels thick with the presence of something much older and much more powerful than your empire. You brace yourself, clutching your shield, and pray to a god you hope is listening. Even as you hear the crack of the first ritual stone of the afternoon, breaking the silence, as the ritualistic fervor on the heights begins to transition into a cold, tactical persistence, you find yourself being pushed further away from the grand plazas and toward the encroaching greenery of the cloud forest. This is the start of the guerrilla war of Vilcabamba, the final jagged chapter of the Inca resistance. Here, the open-air ballistics of the high plateau give way to a claustrophobic nightmare. You are no longer in a world of 300-yard arcs. You are in a vertical jungle where the thrum of a sling might come from, a tree canopy or a hidden crevice just 20 paces away. In this dense terrain, your horses are entirely useless, and your steel armor is a magnet for the moisture that turns your undergarments into a fungal breeding ground. You probably wouldn't survive the transition from soldier to prey as you enter the slinger-esque jungle. Mainstream history often frames the fall of Cusco as the end of the Inca Empire. But in Vilcabamba, the resistance lasted for nearly 40 more years. The sling remained the primary weapon of this shadow state, but its application became even more specialized. You've noticed that the slingers here have switched to smaller, darker stones that are nearly impossible to spot against the mottled green and brown of the forest floor. They don't fire in massive volleys anymore. They fire in sniping pulses. You LLB hacking through a thicket of ferns when warak'a stone strikes the tree next to your head. No smoke, no flash, no sound other than the impact. Historians still argue whether the Inca developed short-cord slings specifically for this jungle warfare to avoid tangling their weapons in the brush. But the terrifying precision of the hits suggests a tool perfectly adapted for tight spaces. There's a quirky, terrifying detail in the Spanish accounts of Vilcabamba. The Inca began to use the silent nature of the sling to conduct ghost raids. They would surround a Spanish camp at night and, without ever showing themselves, pelt the sentries with stones until the entire unit was driven into a state of sleep-deprived hysteria. You've seen men firing their arquebuses into the dark, at nothing, the muzzle flashes only serving to give the slingers a perfect target for their next stone. One of the light-hearted, though increasingly manic jokes among the survivors is that the trees themselves have learned to throw rocks. You look at a mossy limb, and for a second, you're sure it's a warrior's arm. The jungle has become a giant, living warak'a. The scholarly debate regarding the green resistance focuses on how the Inca modified their logistics once they lost access to the great tambos of the highlands. In Vilcabamba, they couldn't rely on massive stockpiles of river stones. Instead, they began to use found ammunition bits of hard volcanic rock or even hand-carved hardwood bullets that were heavy enough to stun a man. You find a projectile lodged in a log. It's a piece of palm wood carved into a perfect sphere and fire-hardened until it's as dense as a marble. It's a testament to their adaptability. They have taken the Stone Age technology and turned it into a biodynamic weapon system that doesn't need a single factory or mine to function. You notice that the rhythmic thrum is gone, replaced by the snap of the short release. It's a faster, more violent sound. In the humid air of the cloud forest, the sound doesn't travel as far, which means that by the time you hear the sling, the stone has already arrived. You probably wouldn't survive the psychological erosion of this war of 1,000 cuts. You're constantly checking your periphery, your neck muscles tight enough to snap. You see a flash of colora macaw, or a warrior's tunic, and you flinch, the memory of a Cavadan helmet flashing in your mind. The Inca haven't just retreated, they've merged with the landscape, and they are using the sling to remind you that every step you take into their forest is a step further into your own grave. There's a fringe theory that the Vilcabamba resistance used poison stones, coating their projectiles in the toxic secretions of jungle, frogs, or the caustic sap of certain vines. While most historians believe this is a conflation with Amazonian blowgun tactics, the fear of a stinging stone is enough to make the men obsessively wash every minor bruise. You see a comrade staring at a small welt on his arm, convinced that the Inca magic is melting his blood. The sling has evolved from a weapon of the battlefield into a weapon of terror. It is no longer about winning a war, it's about making the occupation so painful and so terrifying that you eventually just give up and leave. As you sit in the damp twilight of the forest, you realize that your European superiority has been stripped away, layer by layer. Your horse is gone, your steel is rusting, and your firearms are useless in the rain. But the slinger? He is still there. He doesn't need a dry match. He doesn't need a horse. He only needs a cord of wool and the stones at his feet. You realize that the Inca didn't lose their power when they lost their cities. They just moved it into the shadows. The thrum has become a whisper, and the whisper is more terrifying than the roar of the thunder god ever was. One of the common jokes among the men told in hushed tones so that Captain Does und hears that the Inca are farming Spaniards. They let you grow confident in your little jungle outposts, and then they harvest you with stones whenever you wander too far from the fire. It's a grim way to look at your life, but it fits the reality of the Vilcabamba years. You are a resource being depleted while the mountain and the forest are infinite. You pull your damp, moldy cloak tighter, listening to the drip of the rain and the occasional sharp crack of a falling branch that sounds exactly like a stone hitting wood. The sun never really sets in the deep forest, it just fades into a gray, suffocating mist. You'll realize that out here, in the land of the last Sapa Inca, time is the enemy of the Spaniard. Every day you survive is a day you've lost. The Inca are patient. They have their slings, they have their stones, and they have the entire jungle as their magazine. You close your eyes, but you don't sleep. You're waiting for the thwack in the dark, the silent message from the forest that tells you the war is far from over. You're sitting in the damp shadows of the Vilcabamba mist, clutching a copy of a dispatch from a Spanish chronicler, and you find yourself scoffing at the ink on the page. These writers, safe in their coastal villas or back in the libraries of Madrid, speak of skirmishes with primitive tribesmen and unruly mobs throwing pebbles. This is the misinterpretation of the chronicles, a historical whitewashing that you are living through in real time. You know the truth, these weren't pebbles, and the men throwing them weren't mobs. But the official record has a vested interest in downplaying the lethality of the warak'a. If the Spanish public hand, more importantly, the king knew that the invincible armored knight was being systematically dismantled by a piece of wool and a river stone, the prestige of the empire would crumble faster than the walls of Cusco. Mainstream history is often written by the victors, but in this case, it was written by the embarrassed. The chroniclers often focused on the cowardice of the Inca for fighting from the heights, failing to mention that it was the only logical tactical response to cavalry. You probably wouldn't survive the frustration of reading these accounts 100 years from now. Seeing your life-and-death struggle reduced to a footnote about minor resistance, historians still argue whether writers like Pedro Ciza de Leon or Garcilaso de la Vega intentionally suppressed the technical details of the sling to maintain the narrative of European technological dominance. Or if they simply did unhave the vocabulary to describe the ballistics of a weapon they considered peasant grade. But you've seen a stone flatten a breastplate. There is nothing peasant grade about a weapon that can liquefy a man's internal organs. There's a quirky, almost pathetic detail in some of the letters sent back to Spain. Soldiers would describe the sling stones as bullets of the earth to make their wounds sound more military and less like they'd been beaten in a street fight. It was a way to save face. If you were wounded by a bullet, you were a hero of a modern war. If you were wounded by a stone, you were a victim of a shepherd's tantrum. You see the pride of your captains as they insist on calling the Inca slings engines of the devil, as if attributing the weapon to the supernatural made their own failures more excusable. One of the light-hearted, cynical jokes among the men is that the next batch of recruits should be told they're fighting giants who throw mountains just so they do unfeel so. bad when they get their teeth knocked out by a 10-year-old with a cord, the scholarly debate often centers on the silence of the sling. Why is there so little technical analysis of the warak'a in the primary sources compared to the sword or the archaeobus? The answer is likely professional jealousy. The Spanish military machine was built on the tercios, the world's most advanced infantry formation. To admit that their formation could be shattered by a weapon that didn't even require a forge was an existential threat to their military identity. You notice that the chroniclers spend pages describing the beauty of an Inca palace, but only a sentence on the weapon that defended it. This narrative omission has skewed our understanding of the conquest for centuries, turning a high-tech ballistic conflict into a lopsided massacre that never actually happened on the ground. You've seen the rhythmic thrum dismissed in writing as the noise of the heathens, but you know that noise is the sound of a calculated industrial-scale military operation. One of the fringe theories suggests that some chroniclers actually did write detailed reports on the physics of the sling, but these documents were suppressed by the Council of the Indies to prevent other European powers from adopting the cheap and effective weapon. Imagine if the French or English started equipping their peasants with Andon-style slings. The armored knights of Europe would have been obsolete overnight. You realize you are part of a secret history, a reality of warfare that is being erased even as it kills you. The misinterpretations extend to the stones themselves. Chroniclers often called them random rocks, but as you look at the pile of standardized egg-shaped projectiles near your feet, you see the lie. These were manufactured. This was a state-controlled munitions program. By calling them rocks, the writers robbed the Inca of their logistical genius. It's much easier to colonize a people if you convince yourself they are natural rather than industrial. But as you rub a bruise on your arm that is the exact shape of a standardized river cobble, you know that there is nothing natural about being targeted by a precision-engineered weapon system. There is a light irony in the fact that the only people who truly understood the power of the sling were the ones who were hit by Itand. They were the ones writing the books. You see a veteran sergeant, his face a map of scars from slingstone shrapnel, looking at a priest who is scribbling notes about the simple tools of the Indians. The sergeant doesn't say a word, he just taps his dented helmet and walks away. He knows that the simple tool has more kinetic energy than the priest's entire library. You realize that out here, the truth isn't found in ink, it's found in the thud of the impact. As the sun sets, casting a golden light over the bullets of the earth littering the trail, you feel a strange sense of kinship with the enemy. You are both being misrepresented by history. They are being turned into primitives, and you are being turned into invincible conquerors. Neither is true. You are both just men caught in a brutal, high-velocity struggle where the laws of physics are the only honest witnesses. The rhythmic thrum begins again, a sound that doesn't care about your chronicles or your king. It is a sound that speaks the truth of the mountain. Whether or not anyone back in Madrid is listening, the wind picks up, blowing a page of a discarded journal across the dirt. You watch it tumble away into the ravine, just another piece of paper trying to explain a world it doesn't understand. You pull your quilted hood tighter and look up at the ridge. The slingers are there, silent and unwritten, their walkers already beginning the first slow circles of the evening. They don't need a chronicler to tell their story. The stones will do that for them. And as the first whistle of the night reaches your ears, you realize that history is about to repeat itself, one impact at a time. As you sit in the silence of the forest, listening to the drip of the mist, you start to realize that this secret weapon isn't unique to the Andes. It's part of a global, ancient lineage of lethal physics. Your thoughts drift to the stories you heard in the taverns of Cadiz, about the Balearic slingers of the Roman era, men who were so skilled they supposedly carried 3 different slings for different ranges and could pick a specific soldier out of a legion from hundreds of paces away. This is the global slinging tradition, and standing here in the shadow of a Vilcabamba cliff, you see the parallels. The Inca warak'a is the New World's peak expression of a technology that once dominated the Mediterranean long before the first sword was forged in Toledo. You probably wouldn't survive a face-off between a Balearic mercenary and an Inca warrior. But the comparison highlights a fundamental truth. Before the world became obsessed with gunpowder, the sling was the undisputed king of the open field. Mainstream history often forgets that the sling was the primary long-range weapon for most of human civilization. Whether it was the Greek ronchis or the Roman funda, the mechanics remain identical to the Andean version you're currently hiding from. The Inca, however, took this global concept and perfected it for the most extreme terrain on the planet. Historians still argue whether the Inca independently developed the split pouch design or if it's a case of convergent evolution. The idea that humans, when faced with the need to throw a rock very fast, will eventually arrive at the same mechanical solution. You look at a discarded Inca sling near your feet and realize it's almost identical to the ones used by the shepherds in the mountains of Mallorca. It's a universal language of kinetic energy. There's a quirky, almost legendary connection between these traditions. In the Old World, slingers were often the velocities troops who ended up doing the most damage, much like the Inca units you're facing. There's a story that Roman soldiers used to heat their lead sling bullets called glands so they would melt through the air, mirroring the Inca heated shot strategy you saw at Cusco. One of the lighthearted jokes among the few literate soldiers in your group is that the Romans were lucky they only had to fight Gauls, and not the Inca or the Roman Empire would have ended at the first mountain pass. You see the irony. You've even traveled across an entire ocean only to be defeated by a weapon that your own ancestors used to conquer the world, but which you've since forgotten. The scholarly debate phrase, the ballistic continuum, refers to this unbroken line of human ingenuity. While Europe moved toward the complex, expensive, and fragile technology of the crossbow and the arquebus, the Inca stayed with the perfected simplicity of the sling. You notice that the Inca didn't lack for metal. They had copper, bronze, and gold. They simply chose not to use it for projectiles because the stone was already a perfect delivery system for the energy they could generate. Why build a complex machine when you are the machine? This realization makes you feel a bit like a victim of over-engineering. You're carrying a heavy iron pipe that requires a chemical explosion to work, while your enemy is using a piece of string and a rock to achieve better results. You find yourself wondering if there are slingers in other parts of this new world. You've heard rumors of the Aztecs using the Temet ladle with similar effect. But the Andes are where the weapon truly reached its zenith. There's a fringe theory that the Inca even exported their slinging instructors to conquered territories to ensure a standardized level of marksmanship across the four quarters. Imagine a military academy where the only subject is the physics of the wool cord. It's a chilling thought, a continental empire built on the mastery of a single, devastatingly simple tool. You feel like a small part of a global history of impact, a tiny variable in an equation that was solved thousands of years before you were born. One of the common jokes told by the older veterans who have seen everything from Italy to the Americas is that the old world forgot how to be simple, and that's why you're losing. You're trying to fight a war of the future with tools that aren't ready for the present. While the Inca are fighting a war of the always, they are using the same physics that David used against Goliath. And as you look at your dented helmet, you realize you are playing the role of the giant. You are big, slow, and encased in metal, and you are being systematically dismantled by a faster, lighter opponent who doesn't need to get close to kill you. As the wind moans through the trees, you hear the rhythmic thrum of the slings again, a sound that has echoed through every century of human conflict. It is a universal sound, the sound of the air being displaced by human will. You realize that the Inca hail isn't a local phenomenon. It's the return of a forgotten nightmare. The sling is the ultimate old world weapon that the new world used to humble its discoverers. You pull your quilted hood tighter, feeling the weight of all those centuries of slinging tradition pressing down on you. The sun is a pale, cold disk in the sky, casting long shadows that remind you of the crests of the Roman helmets you saw in old tapestries. You realize that history doesn't move in a straight line. It moves in a circle, much like the rotation of the warak'a. You're back at the beginning, a man on the hillside trying not to get hit by a rock. All your technology, all your ships, and all your gunpowder have brought you to a place where the most important thing in the world is the speed of a piece of braided wool. The thrumming reaches a steady, confident cadence. The global tradition of the sling is alive and well in the hands of the warriors above you. They are the heirs to a legacy of lethality that predates your empire and will likely outlast it. You sit in the cold dirt, a modern soldier being schooled by an ancient master, and you wonder if anyone back home will believe that the most dangerous thing in the Andes was the agua, or the volcano, but the ghost of a weapon they thought was a toy. The damp mist of the Vilcabamba jungle begins to lift in your mind, replaced by the bright, harsh glare of a modern Andean afternoon. You aren't a conquistador anymore, but the rhythmic thrum hasn't faded. It has merely changed its context. You are standing on a windswept plain between the provinces of Chumbivilcas and Canas, watching thousands of people gather for the Shiaraja ritual battle that has been fought for centuries and continues to this day. This is the legacy in the modern Andes, where the weapon that once shattered Spanish steel is still a living, breathing part of the culture. You see men and women wrapped in colorful ponchos, their waraqas, the modern name for the warak'a, tucked into their belts or wrapped around their heads. You probably wouldn't survive a single minute in the middle zone of this festival, where stones still fly with a velocity that reminds you of the 16th century. Mainstream anthropologists often describe these festivals as ritualized conflict, intended to spill blood to fertilize the Earth Mother, Pachamama. But for you, seeing it through the lens of history, it is a high-speed masterclass in ancient ballistics. The technique hasn't changed. The full-body rotation, the whip-crack release, and the secret of the spin are all on display. You see a young man, no older than 18, loose a stone that travels with such speed it's invisible to the naked eye until it strikes a target nearly 200 yards away. Historians still argue whether the shattering is a direct descendant of Inca military training, exercises, or a post-conquest adaptation of indigenous resistance. But the physical reality is undeniable. The skill of the slinger never died. It just went underground, preserved in the high-altitude traditions of the Quechua-speaking heartland. There's a quirky, somewhat jarring detail in these modern festivals. Some participants have started using modern materials like nylon cords or plastic-wrapped grips, yet the core of the weapon remains the same braided wool. You'll see a man in a motorcycle jacket and a traditional knitted chulo hat, winding up a sling with the same rhythm his ancestors used at the siege of Cusco. One of the lighthearted jokes told by modern observers is that if the Inca ever decided to reform their army, they wouldn't need a boot camp. They'd just need to hand out some river stones at the end of the festival. You'll realize that the Andean advantage is still there. The larger lungs, the endurance, and the intuitive grasp of mountain physics that your world has largely forgotten. The scholarly debate regarding the living weapon focuses on how the sling has survived while the bow, the spear, and the club have largely disappeared from daily life. The answer is its utility. In the Haipuna, a shepherd still uses a sling to guide his flock, much like the training of the chosen few we discussed. It remains the most efficient way to project force across a valley without the need for expensive or prohibited firearms. You notice that even in the modern world, the logistics of the tambo exist in a decentralized form. Children spend their afternoons along the riverbeds, instinctively selecting the smooth, egg-shaped stones that will fly the truest. The selection process is a cultural memory passed down through the fingertips. You probably wouldn't survive the clash of the stones at Chiarage without a serious respect for the physics involved. Even today, with modern medicine nearby, the injuries are a grim echo of the past: cracked skulls, broken ribs, and shattered limbs. It is a stark reminder that a river stone doesn't need high technology to be a lethal projectile. One of the common jokes told with a shrug by the locals is that the stones are just the mountain-esque way of reminding everyone who is really in charge. You see the pride in their eyes when they talk about their waraqas. It isn't just a tool, it's an identity. It's the one thing the Spanish could untake away because it lived in the muscles and the mind, not in a forge or an armory. There's a fringe theory among some cultural historians that the whistling stone tradition is still alive in these festivals, though used more for signaling than for psychological terror. You hear a sharp, warbling sound cut through the shouting of the crowd, and for a second, you're back in the mountain pass, feeling the cold sweat of It's an auditory ghost, a link to the geometry of fear that nearly broke the Spanish Empire. You realize that the Inca didn't disappear. They just changed their clothes. Their weapons, their tactics, and their mastery of the vertical world are all still here, hidden in plain sight in the festivals of the high Andes. As you watch the rhythmic thrum of the slings in the modern sun, you feel a sense of closure. The weapon that caved in Morion helmets wasn't a fluke of history. It was a peak expression of human engineering that remains effective today. You see a man rifling a shot with a flick of his wrist, and you know exactly what's happening: the Magnus effect, the gyroscopic stability, the terminal velocity. The science of the stone is still in session. You realize that the Stone Age label was always a misnomer. It wasn't an age of primitive tools. It was an age of perfected mechanics. The sun begins to set over the Chumbivilcas plain, casting long, familiar shadows. The festival is winding down, the participants sharing chicha and tending to their bruises. You look at the ground littered with thousands of smooth river stones, and you realize that this landscape is a permanent magazine of ammunition. The Andes are made of weapons. You pull your modern jacket tighter against the rising cold, feeling the weight of the history you've just traveled through. The thrumming has stopped for today, but you know it will return, as it has for thousands of years. One of the common sayings in the region is that the mountains have long memories. Looking at the slings wrapped around the wrists of the departing crowd, you believe it. The warak'a is a thread that connects the modern farmer to the elite warriors of Manco Inca. It is a weapon of the earth, for the earth. You stand in the silence of the plateau, listening to the wind whistle through the rocks, and you realize that the story of the Inca Sling isn't over. It's just waiting for the next rotation. The sun has finally surrendered to the jagged peaks, leaving behind a sky of deep, bruised violet and a silence so profound you can almost hear the temperature drop. You stand there on the ancient trail, the modern world a distant memory, and you look down at a single smooth river stone resting in your palm. It is cold, heavy, and unassuming, a silent guardian of the peaks that nearly toppled a global empire of steel and gunpowder. You realize now that the story of the Inca Sling isn't just about a weapon. It's about a relationship between a people and the very laws of physics that govern their world. This simple cord of wool and this piece of the earth were enough to neutralize the most advanced technology of the 16th century because they were born from the landscape itself. Your steel was an intruder here, but the stone was at home. Mainstream history has a way of smoothing over the jagged edges of the past, turning the terrifying rain of stones into a clean narrative of inevitable conquest. But you've seen the Covenant helmets. You've felt the rhythmic thrum of the Inca hail in your own bones. You know that the primitive label was a shield the Spanish used to protect their own pride. Historians still argue whether the Inca would have eventually adapted their military to completely expel the European presence, if they had been ravaged by old-world diseases first. But looking at the kinetic efficiency of the warak'a, the answer feels clear. You probably wouldn't survive a second attempt at conquest if the playing field were leveled by health alone. The sling was the great equalizer of the Andes, a weapon that proved that muscle and momentum can defeat metallurgy every single time. There's a quirky final detail to consider. Some of the most iconic Inca walls in Cusco still bear the circular pitting of Spanish cannonballs, but the Spanish armor in the museums bears the dents of Inca stones. It's a physical dialogue between two civilizations that could understand each other as language, but understood each other as physics perfectly. You see a light irony in the fact that the Stone Age civilization created a ballistics program so advanced that it forced the Iron Age conquerors to dress in cotton quilts like the people they were trying to colonize. One of the common jokes you might hear in a Cusco tavern today is that the Spanish did conquer the Inca. The mountains just allowed them to stay for a while. The scholarly debate regarding the persistence of the warak'a reminds us that technology isn't always a linear progression. Sometimes the most effective solution is the one that has been perfected over 3,000 years. You notice that the secret of the spin and the logistics of the tambo were unjust military tactics. They were the pillars of a society that understood how to harness the environment. You pull your cloak tighter, the cold Andean wind whistling through the gaps in the rock. It's the same whistle you've been hearing throughout this journey, the sound of the air being cut into pieces by a weapon that refuses to be forgotten. The rhythmic thrum is gone now, replaced by the soft, steady breathing of the mountain at night. You realize that your journey through the ballistics of the Inca has been a lesson in humility. You've seen how a piece of braided llama wool could outrange a rifle, outpace a crossbow, and shatter the pride of a knight. The silent guardian of the peaks didn't need fire or smoke to make its mark. It just needed the truth of gravity. You look up at the stars, so bright and cold in the thin air, and you imagine Illapa swinging his sling across the Milky Way, ready to crack the sky once more. The world is quieting down now, and the frantic pace of the battle is fading into the soft, velvet shadows of the night. Think of the long, slow journey back down the mountain, each step heavy but sure, as the weight of the steel and the fear begins to lift from your shoulders. The thin air is becoming a gentle hum in your ears, a soothing lullaby that carries the scent of dry grass and ancient stone. You are safe now, tucked away in the cradle of the peaks, where the only sounds are the rustle of the wind and the distant, rhythmic pulse of the earth herself. Let the images of the spinning wool and the polished river stones soften and blur like a painting in the rain. Your breathing is deep and steady, matching the slow, eternal cycle of the seasons in this high, sacred place. The mountains are standing watch, their jagged silhouettes protecting you from the noise of the world below. You are wrapped in a blanket as soft as alpaca wool, feeling the warmth of the fire that has long since burned down to a comforting, cherry-red glow. The story is told, the history is settled, and the stones are back in the river, waiting for the water to polish them for another 1,000 years. Close your eyes and let the thrum of the warak'a become a heartbeat. A steady reminder that you are part of something much older and much larger than yourself. Sleep now, while the stars move in their long, silent arcs across the sky, and let the peace of the Andes carry you into the deep, dreamless dark.